Imagine a cold, silent night in occupied Poland, 1942. The streets are empty, the only sounds the faint whispers of those hiding, as a shadow passes through town. A shadow that will decide who lives and who dies. Adolf Hitler's machinery of death moves with terrifying precision, orchestrating a plan so vast that millions are marked for annihilation before they even know it. In the ghettos, families huddle together, clutching their children, unaware that the next knock at the door could mean deportation to a camp from which almost no one returns. Across the forests, partisan groups prepare ambushes, while underground networks forge documents and smuggle food. Every act of defiance could mean execution. Every mistake could cost a life. Hitler sits behind his maps and plans, his obsession with the final solution chillingly precise, as if the fate of humanity is merely a piece on his grand chessboard of terror. This is not just history. It is a journey into the darkest corners of human cruelty, courage, and resilience. Tonight, we step into that world to witness the terror, the harrowing decisions, and the moments of resistance that shone like fragile lights in a night of unimaginable darkness. Before we continue, take a moment. Hit that like if you're finding this journey through history compelling. Subscribe so you don't miss any chapters, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about this story of survival and courage. By the end of this video, you might even be drifting off to sleep, so take a second now. It only takes a moment and really helps the channel. Chapter 1: Shadows Before the Storm. Jewish life in Poland before World War II. Before the Second World War, Poland was home to one of the largest and most vibrant Jewish populations in the world. More than 3 million Jews lived in cities, towns, and villages across the country, from the bustling streets of Warsaw and Krakow to small shtetls nestled in the countryside. This community was not monolithic. It included deeply religious Hasidic sects, secular intellectuals, artisans, merchants, and factory workers. In the cities, Jewish theaters, newspapers, political parties, and schools flourished, while in rural areas traditional life and customs persisted. The sound of Yiddish conversations mixed with Polish in marketplaces. Synagogues stood next to Catholic churches, and Jewish tailors, bakers, and cobblers worked alongside their non-Jewish neighbors. This was a community deeply intertwined with the fabric of Polish society, but also distinctly its own. Despite centuries of intermittent discrimination, Jewish life in interwar Poland was experiencing a cultural renaissance. Warsaw was called the Jerusalem of Europe because of its intense religious scholarship and its thriving secular press. In towns like Lublin and Vilna, now Vilnius, Lithuania, yeshivas trained thousands of students. Political movements such as the Socialist Bund, the Zionist parties, and various religious groups competed for influence, creating a lively public sphere. Artists and writers such as Isaac Bashevis Singer drew inspiration from the daily rhythms of Jewish life. Jewish theaters performed in Yiddish, newspapers printed in multiple languages, and community organizations provided welfare, healthcare, and education. For many Jews, Poland was not just a place of residence but the spiritual and cultural heartland of their people. Yet this rich tapestry existed alongside rising anti-Semitism. In the 1930s, economic hardship and nationalist politics led to growing hostility toward Jewish citizens. Boycotts of Jewish businesses, quotas in universities, and occasional violence signaled an increasingly hostile climate. Still, most Jews in Poland did not imagine that their centuries-old communities were living on the brink of destruction. They debated emigration, but few foresaw the scale of what was to come. In 1939, as Europe edged toward war, many Jewish families continued their daily routines, sending children to school, planning weddings, and running shops, unaware that within a few short years their lives would be upended. The landscape of pre-war Jewish Poland was one of contrasts, between tradition and modernity, integration and separation, prosperity and poverty, hope and fear. In Warsaw alone, more than 350,000 Jews formed a city within a city, with its own hospitals, libraries, and political clubs. In smaller towns, life was slower, more religious, and often poorer, but also tightly knit. Weddings were major communal events. Sabbath evenings glowed with candlelight, and the cycle of Jewish holidays provided rhythm to the year. The streets echoed with Yiddish songs, children's games, and merchants' cries. Such details matter because they reveal not just statistics but a living world, one that would soon be targeted for destruction. Understanding this pre-war reality is crucial for grasping the magnitude of the Holocaust in Poland. When the Nazis invaded in 1939, they did not encounter a scattered minority but a deeply rooted community whose presence stretched back hundreds of years. Jews had been part of Polish history since the Middle Ages, invited by kings to settle and contribute to the economy. Over centuries they endured pogroms, partitions, and shifting borders, but maintained a vibrant communal life. By the 20th century, Poland was both a cradle of Jewish religious learning and a center of modern Jewish politics. This dual identity, deeply traditional yet also modern, made it a unique and irreplaceable part of Jewish civilization. The memory of this world is essential because it humanizes what came after. The Holocaust in Poland was not just the destruction of individuals but the obliteration of entire communities, languages, customs, and cultural achievements. Before we turn to the grim story of persecution, ghettos, and death camps, it is important to linger on this lost world. Think of the crowded markets of Lodz, the quiet prayer rooms of small-town synagogues, the lively debates in Jewish cafes, and the children running through cobbled streets. Each of these scenes belonged to a society that had survived wars, plagues, and political upheavals but would not survive the Nazi regime in the late 1930s. Some Jews did sense danger. Refugees from Germany arrived with stories of persecution, boycotts, and new racial laws. Jewish leaders debated how to respond. Should they encourage emigration to Palestine or the Americas? Should they strengthen self-defense groups? Should they trust that Poland's state institutions would protect them? For most, life went on much as before. School terms began, newspapers published, and theaters staged new plays. The very ordinariness of life was part of the tragedy. A world on the edge of catastrophe rarely recognizes its own fragility. This chapter is not just background. It is a remembrance of lives lived. The Holocaust in Poland was not an abstract event, but the destruction of a civilization that had taken centuries to build. In towns like Białystok, Kalisz, and Przemysl, Jews had created networks of education, mutual aid, and culture. They had woven themselves into Poland's economy as traders, craftsmen, and professionals. They were neighbors, classmates, and citizens. To understand the scale of the crime, one must first understand the richness of what was lost. That is why historians, survivors, and descendants still speak of pre-war Poland with a mixture of pride, nostalgia, and grief. It was the soil from which countless lives and stories grew, and in 1939 it still seemed permanent as night falls on our imagination of that past. We see candlelit windows, bustling marketplaces, children clutching school books, and families preparing for the Sabbath. We hear the hum of Yiddish and Polish mingling in the air. This was the world at the edge of an abyss, a world whose vibrancy makes its destruction even more unfathomable. Only by remembering this can we begin to grasp the enormity of what came after. To truly picture Jewish life in pre-war Poland, one has to step into its sensory richness, because the destruction that followed was not of anonymous victims but of individuals and communities with deep, complex lives. Imagine a spring morning in Krakow's Kazimierz district, where bakers carried fresh loaves from the oven, children hurried to cheddar with books under their arms, and merchants arranged colorful fabrics in shop windows. Each of these small routines was part of a rhythm shaped by centuries of coexistence and struggle. Jews in Poland had learned to navigate an often precarious balance, maintaining their traditions while interacting daily with Catholic neighbors, paying taxes to Polish authorities, and sending their children to both Jewish and Polish schools. Many spoke Polish fluently while keeping Yiddish for home and community life. This bilingual world reflected both integration and separateness, a duality that would become tragically relevant after 1939. The diversity within Jewish society in Poland before the war was extraordinary. The Hasidic courts of towns like Babawa and Gur attracted followers who came to hear their rebbes teach mystical interpretations of the Torah. In contrast, secular Jewish youth joined socialist or Zionist movements, organizing cultural events and summer camps that rejected traditional piety in favor of modern ideas. Women's roles were also changing. While some continued to maintain traditional households, others became doctors, teachers, or activists. Newspapers such as Haint and Moment debated politics and culture in Yiddish, while Polish-language Jewish publications catered to the more assimilated urban elite. These overlapping circles created a vibrant, sometimes fractious but always dynamic community. It was a world in motion, negotiating modernity and tradition on its own terms. Economically, Jewish life ranged from wealth to deep poverty. Some families owned factories, export businesses, or banks. Others eked out a living as peddlers or tailors. In small towns, Jewish and non-Jewish Poles often depended on one another's goods and services. Markets were communal spaces where peasants sold produce to Jewish shopkeepers, who then resold or exported it. This interdependence bred both familiarity and resentment, especially during economic downturns. By the late 1930s, Poland was suffering from widespread unemployment and inflation. Nationalist groups exploited this by blaming Jews for the country's woes, calling for boycotts and restrictions. These hostilities, though painful, still seemed like an extension of old prejudices rather than a sign of impending annihilation. Most Jews believed they would endure, as they had before. Religious life remained a cornerstone. Sabbath in Jewish neighborhoods transformed the streets. Shops closed, candles flickered in windows, and families gathered for meals after synagogue prayers. High holy days such as Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur filled synagogues to capacity, while Passover brought the scent of matzah and spring cleaning. At the same time, secular Jewish theaters performed operettas and avant-garde plays, and cafes hosted heated debates on politics and art. This coexistence of sacred and secular, of prayer shawls and newspapers, of rabbis and radical youth, marked Jewish Poland as uniquely multifaceted. It was not a static old world, but a living culture grappling with change. Education was another pillar. Jewish children might attend a heder for basic religious instruction, a Polish public school for secular subjects, or one of the many Jewish gymnasiums that combined modern curricula with Jewish studies. Yeshivas in places like Lublin attracted students from across Europe. Meanwhile, universities in Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów saw rising numbers of Jewish students despite quotas limiting their enrollment. Many of these young people dreamed of becoming lawyers, scientists, or writers. Some planned to emigrate to Palestine, the United States, or Argentina. Others hoped to build their futures in Poland. The intellectual ferment of these years produced not only scholarship but also the leadership and underground networks that would later be crucial in resisting Nazi oppression. the political landscape was equally complex. Jewish parties competed vigorously in local and national elections, from Orthodox groups like Agudath Israel to secular socialist and Zionist factions. The Bund organized trade unions and cultural clubs. Revisionist Zionists promoted militancy and emigration, while left-wing groups emphasized class solidarity with Polish workers. This political pluralism gave Jews a voice but also fragmented their response to mounting threats. When refugees from Nazi Germany arrived with alarming reports of new racial laws, boycotts, and violence, Jewish leaders debated whether Poland could face something similar. Some argued for emigration, but restrictive immigration policies in other countries made escape difficult. Others believed Poland's government, despite its flaws, would protect its citizens. Few foresaw the systematic, state-organized extermination that was about to unfold. The physical spaces of Jewish life, synagogues, schools, markets, cemeteries, embodied centuries of history. In cities like Lodz, magnificent synagogues reflected the wealth of industrialist patrons, while in small towns humble wooden shuls served close-knit congregations. Jewish cemeteries held not only the remains of ancestors, but also centuries of gravestones inscribed in Hebrew and Yiddish, testaments to continuity. Pilgrimages to the graves of famous rabbis were common, as were annual fairs tied to religious festivals. These customs connected Jews to a shared past even as the world around them modernized. The destruction of these spaces during the war would later symbolize the erasure of entire communities. Understanding this pre-war environment also clarifies the stakes of what followed. The Holocaust in Poland was not just mass murder but the obliteration of a civilization that had developed its own institutions, languages, and ways of life. When Nazi forces invaded, they encountered not a scattered minority but a deeply rooted population with its own economy, schools, and political parties. This made Poland both the epicenter of Jewish life in Europe and, tragically, the primary killing ground of the Holocaust. The very density and vibrancy of Jewish Poland made it a target for Nazi ideology, which sought not only to dominate but to annihilate. Looking back, the poignancy lies in the ordinariness of the final pre-war years. Weddings were still celebrated with dancing and klezmer music. Children still learned Hebrew letters by candlelight. Scholars still debated Talmudic passages late into the night. Families still planned for the future. Yet by the summer of 1939, ominous clouds gathered. Germany had already absorbed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and Hitler's rhetoric about Jews grew more venomous. Refugees brought horrifying stories, but many Poles, Jewish and non-Jewish, hoped war could be avoided or contained. They had endured partitions, uprisings, and occupations before. Surely, they thought life would go on. This illusion of continuity is what makes the history of the Holocaust in Poland so haunting. It was not only lives but an entire way of life that was destroyed almost overnight. When we recall this lost world, we do more than mourn. We honor the richness of a civilization that contributed immeasurably to Polish and European culture. Every synagogue, newspaper, school, and market stall was part of a vast mosaic. By remembering it, we resist the erasure that the Nazis sought to achieve. We also gain a deeper understanding of the human stakes of history, how quickly a society can move from ordinary prejudice to unimaginable violence. As you drift into this story, picture a candlelit room on a Friday evening, a mother blessing her children, a father humming an old melody, the family table set with bread and wine. Outside, a neighbor closes his shop, a tram rattles down the street, a boy runs home with a loaf of bread. This was the texture of Jewish life in Poland on the eve of its destruction. Fragile, beautiful, and unaware of the storm about to break. By holding this image, we begin to comprehend the depth of the loss and the urgency of remembrance. Chapter 2: The Invasion of 1939. Poland under Nazi occupation. At dawn on September 1, 1939, the sound of German artillery shattered the stillness of Polish towns and villages. Columns of Wehrmacht soldiers poured across the borders from the west, while Luftwaffe planes roared overhead, dropping bombs on roads, railways, and cities. The long-feared war had begun. For Poland's Jewish population, more than 3 million strong, the invasion marked the beginning of a catastrophe that would unfold with terrifying speed. At first, many thought it would be another temporary conflict, as Poland had seen invasions and occupations before. But the scale and ferocity of the German attack made clear that this was unlike anything in living memory. Within weeks, Poland was overwhelmed by two invading armies: Nazi Germany from the west and, after September 17th, the Soviet Union from the east. The country was carved apart, and its people were plunged into a new reality of occupation, terror, and uncertainty. For Jewish communities, the first days of war were chaotic and frightening. Families fled towns under bombardment, seeking safety in the countryside or trying to cross into Soviet-controlled areas. Refugee columns clogged the roads, mingling soldiers, civilians, and livestock. German aircraft strafed these convoys, killing indiscriminately. In cities like Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow, air raid sirens wailed day and night. Food and fuel grew scarce. Amid this chaos, rumors spread. The Germans were killing civilians, burning synagogues, and rounding up Jewish men. Some stories were exaggerated. Others underestimated the danger. Still, most people thought survival meant enduring the occupation until peace returned. Few imagined that an entire population was about to be systematically annihilated. The Nazis wasted no time imposing their rule. In the western areas annexed directly to Germany, such as Poznan and Upper Silesia, Polish institutions were dismantled, and German administrators took control. In the so-called general government, which included central and southern Poland, the Nazis set up a colonial-style administration under Hans Frank. This region became a laboratory for German racial policies and later the core territory of the Holocaust. Jews immediately became targets. Within days of occupation, German soldiers humiliated rabbis, cut off men's beards, forced people to sweep streets or crawl on the ground, and looted Jewish shops. Synagogues were desecrated or burned. These acts were not random cruelty, but the opening moves of a systematic program to degrade and isolate Jewish communities. At first, Nazi policies in Poland resembled an intensified version of what Jews had already seen in Germany since 1933: boycotts, public humiliation, and forced labor. But in occupied Poland, the scale was far greater. Jews were ordered to wear identifying armbands with the Star of David. Curfews restricted their movement. Wealthy families were forced to hand over valuables. Jewish councils, or Judenrat, were established under German orders to administer Nazi decrees, such as collecting taxes, organizing forced labor, and compiling lists of residents. This strategy gave the appearance of local self-administration while making Jewish leaders complicit in their own community's oppression. It also provided the Nazis with efficient control over a massive population. Meanwhile, ordinary Polish life also collapsed. The German occupation was brutal toward all Poles, not only Jews. Intellectuals, clergy, and political leaders were arrested or executed in an effort to decapitate Polish society. Schools and universities were closed. Food was requisitioned for the German army, causing shortages and hunger. For Jews, however, the situation was uniquely dire. They were excluded from ration cards, pushed into menial labor, and subjected to random violence. German propaganda painted them as subhuman and blamed them for the war. This relentless dehumanization laid the groundwork for what was to come. The Soviet occupation of eastern Poland brought a different, though also harsh, experience. Many Jews fled eastward, believing the Soviets would be less dangerous than the Nazis. In some ways they were right. Mass extermination was not Soviet policy. But deportations, property confiscations, and suppression of religious and political life were widespread. Jewish refugees found themselves torn between two oppressive regimes, separated from family and uncertain of the future. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, these eastern territories too would fall under Nazi control, extending the Holocaust to virtually all of Poland's pre-war Jewish population. For the first months of occupation, survival strategies varied. Some Jews tried to blend in using false papers or moving to areas with fewer Germans. Others relied on Polish neighbors for food and information. Smuggling became essential as the Nazis restricted supplies. Underground networks began to form, though at first their goal was survival rather than resistance. People whispered about mass shootings in the countryside, about transports of Jewish men disappearing. But the full scale of Nazi plans was still hidden. Most thought that, however terrible the occupation, it would end with the war. They could not yet conceive of the final solution that would be decided in Berlin and implemented on Polish soil. What makes this period so chilling in retrospect is its deceptive normality. After the initial shock of invasion, daily life resumed in distorted form. Shops opened under new regulations. Schools for Jewish children closed, but informal classes continued in private homes. Religious services were banned or restricted, but people prayed secretly. Weddings and births still occurred. People still planned for the future, even as deportations and massacres began in rural areas. This mixture of routine and terror lulled many into thinking that endurance was possible, that survival meant adaptation. In reality, each new decree was a step toward annihilation. The German occupation of Poland in 1939 thus marked the beginning of a process. From invasion to occupation, from persecution to segregation, from segregation to extermination. The first stage, shock and subjugation, was swift and devastating. In the coming years, the Nazis would transform occupied Poland into the epicenter of their genocidal project. They chose this land not only because of its large Jewish population, but also because its geography and infrastructure suited mass killing. Rail lines ran from all over Europe into Poland. Remote rural areas could conceal camps. A colonized population could be terrorized into compliance. All these factors converged to make Poland the ground zero of the Holocaust. As you imagine these early months, picture the streets of Warsaw under German occupation. Soldiers marching, shop signs in German, rabbis forced to scrub sidewalks while crowds watched. Picture families huddled in cellars as bombs fell, children clutching bundles, mothers trying to comfort them. Picture the confusion, the disbelief, the stubborn hope that this nightmare would pass. This was the beginning of the Holocaust in Poland. Not yet the death camps, but the slow tightening of a noose around an entire people. In the autumn and winter of 1939, the initial chaos of the invasion hardened into an organized system of terror. German authorities worked rapidly to dismantle Polish civil institutions, replacing them with a regime designed to exploit, control, and terrorize the population. For the Jews of Poland, this meant a new phase of life defined by humiliation, forced labor, and the first steps toward segregation. The very streets they had walked freely just months earlier now bore German signs and soldiers with rifles slung over their shoulders. Identity became destiny. The The Star of David armband marked its wearer for persecution, separating Jewish citizens from their non-Jewish neighbors and foreshadowing an ever-narrowing space in which they could exist. Daily life under the new order changed almost overnight. German commanders confiscated homes, shops, and factories, expelling Jewish families and giving their property to German settlers or collaborators. Entire neighborhoods were cleared with little warning. Wealthy Jews lost businesses they had built over generations. Middle-class families saw bank accounts frozen and goods seized. Poorer Jews were rounded up for forced labor, clearing rubble, repairing roads, or hauling heavy loads for soldiers. The labor was unpaid and brutal. Beatings were common. Many people tried to bribe officials to escape the worst jobs, selling family heirlooms or smuggling valuables, but the system was relentless. It was designed not merely to exploit but to break the spirit. Simultaneously, the Nazis began a campaign of psychological warfare. They staged public humiliations, such as forcing Jewish men to cut each other's beards or sweep streets while onlookers jeered. They stormed synagogues, desecrating Torah scrolls and setting prayer houses ablaze. They imposed collective fines for imagined offenses and took hostages from community leaders to ensure compliance. These measures were not random acts of cruelty. They were part of a deliberate plan to strip Jews of dignity, identity, and any sense of belonging in the society they had helped build. The message was unmistakable. You are no longer citizens, no longer neighbors, but outsiders whose lives depend on our whim. At the administrative level, Jewish councils, Judenrat, became the intermediaries between the German authorities and the Jewish population. Composed of respected community figures, these councils were ordered to distribute labor quotas, collect taxes, and enforce Nazi decrees. The councils faced impossible choices. Refusal meant immediate execution. Compliance meant facilitating the oppression of one's own people. Many tried to mitigate harm, negotiating better food rations, organizing clinics, or setting up soup kitchens. But they were trapped in a system designed to turn them into instruments of control. This structure allowed the Nazis to manage millions of people with minimal manpower while sowing distrust within the communities they targeted. Outside the Jewish neighborhoods, Polish society was also reeling. The Nazis aimed to decapitate Polish national life by arresting teachers, priests, lawyers, and politicians. Thousands were executed or sent to concentration camps in Germany. Polish culture and education were suppressed, and the economy was reorganized to serve the German war effort. Yet the persecution of Jews was distinct both in scale and in intent. While Poles were oppressed, Jews were marked for complete social exclusion. They were banned from public transport, forced out of public spaces, and subjected to random street roundups. This dual system, general oppression for Poles, targeted dehumanization for Jews, created an atmosphere where the unthinkable could gradually become routine. Information about Nazi policies spread unevenly. In rural areas, word of mouth carried rumors of massacres in nearby towns. In cities, underground newspapers circulated fragments of news from abroad. Refugees from Western Poland described shootings and deportations, but many listeners could not grasp the implications. How could a modern state carry out mass murder on a scale unseen in history? Even when synagogues burned and entire communities vanished, survivors hoped they had been relocated, not killed. This denial was not naive. It was a human response to unimaginable horror. In the general government, new regulations multiplied. Curfews, travel restrictions, confiscation of radios, and limits on food rations. Jews received less than half the caloric allowance of non-Jews, forcing many into smuggling. Children became runners, slipping through fences to buy bread or potatoes, risking arrest or execution. Families bartered clothing for food, surviving day to day. Some Polish neighbors sympathized and offered help at great personal risk, while others exploited the situation by denouncing Jews to the Gestapo or taking over their businesses. These moral complexities would intensify as the occupation deepened. The early months of German rule also saw the first organized killings. In smaller towns and villages, SS units and police battalions conducted mass shootings of Jewish men, often under the pretext of anti-partisan operations. In places like Częstochowa, Piotrkow, and Bydgoszcz, hundreds were killed in single incidents. These massacres were precursors to the industrial-scale killing that would follow. They also served as tests, both of German personnel and of local reactions, to increasingly radical policies. By the spring of 1940, it was clear that the Nazis were not merely oppressing Jews but preparing for something far more sinister. Meanwhile, the borders between German and Soviet-occupied Poland became lines of desperate movement. Families split apart as some tried to flee eastward, only to find themselves trapped or deported by Soviet authorities. Others stayed in the West, hoping the Germans would treat them as they treated Jews in Germany, harshly but not fatally. Still others pinned their hopes on emigration, writing to relatives abroad or seeking visas that rarely materialized. Each decision was a gamble with survival. What defined this period most was a sense of tightening confinement. Rights disappeared one by one. Spaces of freedom shrank. Each new decree built upon the last, creating a legal and physical cage around Jewish life. At first, these measures could seem like temporary wartime hardships. But to historians looking back, they form a clear pattern, the prelude to ghettoization and, eventually, extermination. By late 1939 and early 1940, German planners were already discussing how to concentrate Jews in specific areas, laying the groundwork for the ghettos that would soon dominate Jewish existence in Poland. To imagine this moment is to stand at the edge of a precipice. The world of pre-war Jewish Poland still existed in fragments. Families still lit Sabbath candles. Children still played in courtyards. Newspapers still circulated, but all under a pall of fear. German soldiers patrolled the streets. Neighbors disappeared overnight. Rumors of massacres whispered through markets. A society built over centuries was being dismantled piece by piece. For those living it, the future was uncertain but still, perhaps, survivable. For us, with hindsight, it is the moment before the abyss. As you picture these scenes. Crowded roads of refugees, confiscated shops, families huddled in darkened rooms. Remember that this was only the beginning. The invasion of 1939 did not immediately bring gas chambers and death camps. It brought chaos, humiliation, and loss of freedom. But in that chaos, the machinery of genocide was already being assembled, and Poland, with its dense Jewish population and strategic location, was becoming the center of a crime that would shock the world. Chapter 3: The Birth of Persecution. Anti-Jewish laws and the first measures. When the first shock of the German invasion began to settle, a new reality emerged for Poland's Jews. One that was not just about military defeat but about a deliberate, calculated effort to erase their presence from public life. By the end of 1939, the Nazi occupation authorities had moved beyond random acts of terror and humiliation into a phase of systematic persecution through laws, decrees, and regulations. This phase can be seen as the formal birth of the Holocaust in Poland, because it laid the legal and administrative groundwork for segregation, dispossession, and ultimately extermination. The earliest decrees targeted visibility and identity. In many towns, Jews were compelled to wear white armbands with a blue Star of David, later replaced in some areas by a yellow badge. What might seem a simple cloth marker was in fact a devastating tool. It stripped people of anonymity, making them instantly identifiable for abuse, arrest, or exclusion. Children were bullied, workers dismissed, and shoppers refused service. The armband became a symbol of isolation, a boundary between them and us that widened with each passing week. Those who tried to go without the armband risked beatings or execution. In some towns, German soldiers used it as a pretext for public cruelty, tearing off badges and then punishing the offender for not wearing one. Alongside visible identification came economic strangulation. Jewish-owned shops were seized or Aryanized and handed over to Germans or sympathetic Poles. Bank accounts were frozen, professionals barred from practicing their trades, and licenses revoked. In cities like Lodz and Krakow, entire commercial districts lost their Jewish proprietors within months. Families who had built businesses over generations were reduced to peddling on street corners or selling their last possessions. These measures did not simply impoverish Jews. They cut off the networks of economic interdependence that had bound Jewish and non-Jewish communities together, isolating Jews socially as well as financially. Forced labor was another early instrument of persecution. Even before the ghettos were created, Jewish men and women were ordered to report for work gangs clearing rubble, repairing roads, or hauling military supplies. Conditions were harsh. Little food, brutal guards, and long hours in all weather. Some labor battalions were sent far from home, separating families. People tried to obtain exemptions by bribing officials, but these too were temporary. Forced labor drained the physical strength of communities while instilling a sense of hopelessness. It also familiarized German authorities with the logistics of mass mobilization, lists, quotas, transports, that they would later apply on a far larger and deadlier scale. At the same time, cultural and religious life was dismantled piece by piece. Jewish schools were closed, synagogues desecrated or requisitioned for storage, and public gatherings banned. Newspapers and printing presses were seized. Rabbis were harassed or arrested, community leaders humiliated. In places where Jewish councils tried to organize welfare or clandestine schooling, they had to do so under constant surveillance. Yet, even under these conditions, people tried to preserve a semblance of normalcy. Families held secret prayer meetings. Teachers taught in private apartments. Underground newspapers began to circulate, offering news and a sense of solidarity. These small acts of defiance were seeds of the underground networks that would later emerge. The legal machinery of persecution was coordinated from the top. In the general government, Hans Frank issued decrees that codified discrimination. Jews were banned from parks, theaters, and public transport. They could not own radios, telephones, or even bicycles. Travel between towns required special permits rarely granted. Curfews confined them to their homes after dark. Food rations for Jews were set at starvation levels, often less than 300 calories a day, forcing people into smuggling or barter just to survive. Each new regulation chipped away at autonomy and dignity, making life not only difficult but impossible without breaking some law. This was intentional, a system designed to criminalize existence itself. Even the administrative language reflected the dehumanization at work. Jews were described as contaminants or problems to be solved. This rhetoric filtered down to local officials and ordinary Germans, normalizing acts of cruelty. In towns across Poland, posters warned Poles not to buy from Jews or face punishment. Children absorbed these messages at school. Former neighbors became informants. Yet at the same time, there were also Poles who quietly helped Jewish friends, bringing food, hiding valuables, or offering shelter at great personal risk. This mixture of betrayal and solidarity would characterize much of occupied Poland, highlighting the moral pressures placed on everyone living under the regime. Mass shootings during this early period were still sporadic but increasing. In some towns, German police or SS units executed groups of Jewish men in reprisal for imagined resistance. These killings served as terror tactics, breaking any sense of security. They also tested the reaction of local populations and German soldiers alike, easing the psychological barriers to mass murder. By 1940, the groundwork for larger-scale operations had been laid. Jews were now a population marked, impoverished, segregated, and forced into dependency, a precondition for the next stage, ghettoization. What makes this chapter of history especially haunting is how quickly normal life eroded. Within months of the invasion, centuries-old communities lost their legal rights, their livelihoods, and their freedom of movement. Parents who had once planned to send children to university now worried about finding bread for the next day. Business owners became street vendors. Rabbis and scholars became forced laborers. The change was not just material but existential. People were being redefined from citizens to pariahs, from neighbors to targets. And because the process was incremental, many still hoped it was temporary, believing that if they kept their heads down and complied, they could outlast the storm. Yet these measures were not temporary. They were the first bricks in a wall that would soon close around Poland's Jews completely. When we read survivor testimonies, we often hear about this period as a time of confusion and disbelief. People knew they were being persecuted but could not fathom the ultimate goal. Some still thought in terms of expulsion, imagining deportation to Madagascar or Siberia as the worst case. Very few could imagine extermination. This gap between perception and reality allowed the Nazis to escalate their policies with minimal resistance, moving from legal persecution to physical destruction. As you picture these early months of systematic persecution, imagine a bustling street gradually emptied of its familiar faces. Shop signs changed, families wearing armbands, children no longer at school. Imagine curfews and hunger, and the constant fear of a knock at the door. This was not yet the Holocaust as we know it, but its prelude, a deliberate unweaving of the social fabric that had sustained Jewish life in Poland for centuries. As 1940 progressed, the Nazi occupation refined and deepened the machinery of persecution. What had begun as visible signs, bans, and arbitrary terror was systematized into a routine of daily degradation. The rhythm of Jewish life in Poland became one of endless decrees, confiscations, and forced adjustments, each one eroding the possibility of normal existence. For many, this period was like living inside a tightening vice. Each new rule compressed their world a little further, cutting off escape routes and reducing options until only survival, day by day, remained. A key instrument of this tightening was the introduction of the Jewish councils, or Judenrat, imposed by German authorities in towns and cities. These councils were ordered to carry out Nazi directives within the Jewish community, compiling lists, collecting taxes and valuables, organizing forced labor, and distributing ration cards. The Nazis framed them as self-government, but in reality they were a mechanism of control. Council members, often respected figures before the war, faced impossible moral dilemmas. Comply and become an instrument of oppression, or resist and risk execution. Some tried to use their position to shield their communities, arranging food supplies or lobbying for exemptions. Others succumbed to corruption or despair. In every case, the councils were a bitter reminder of how deeply the occupiers had penetrated the fabric of Jewish communal life. With the councils in place, German officials began imposing collective fines on Jewish communities, seizing cash, gold, and household goods under the guise of war contributions. In many towns, Jews were forced to hand over furs, radios, or typewriters. These confiscations stripped families not only of wealth but of tools for communication and survival. Black markets emerged as people sold heirlooms for food or coal, but even these became dangerous as informants and German police cracked down. This forced economic expropriation, combined with rationing and forced labor, created a cycle of poverty and dependency that the Nazis exploited at every turn. While the visible machinery of persecution grew, the cultural erasure accelerated. Religious leaders were frequent targets of public humiliation. In Krakow, rabbis were paraded through the streets with beards cut off. In smaller towns, synagogues were burned or turned into warehouses. Torah scrolls were desecrated, cemeteries vandalized. Schools that had survived the first months of occupation were closed, and any semblance of organized Jewish education went underground. Teachers continued to hold lessons in secret, passing notes and textbooks from apartment to apartment. The risk was great, but so was the determination to preserve some semblance of identity. For a people whose faith and learning had been central to their existence, the destruction of synagogues and schools was a wound as deep as hunger. This was also the period when forced resettlements began in earnest. Even before ghettos were built, German authorities uprooted Jewish families from their homes and herded them into other districts or smaller towns. These moves were justified as population transfers, but were often chaotic and brutal. People were given hours to pack, forced to abandon possessions, and marched or transported in overcrowded wagons. Families were separated, children lost. In some areas, these resettlements were rehearsals for the mass deportations to come, familiarizing local police and administrators with the logistics of moving thousands under duress. Public space became increasingly dangerous. Jews were banned from sidewalks in some cities, required to step off the curb when Germans passed. They were forbidden from owning pets, from buying meat, from traveling on trams. Even the most mundane activities, sending a letter, visiting a relative, required permits and bribes. The cumulative effect of these regulations was psychological as well as physical. A constant reminder that one's life was no longer one's own. The occupiers sought not only to impoverish but to humiliate, to grind down the spirit and make resistance seem futile. And yet, amid the suffocating environment, signs of resilience flickered. Secret welfare networks distributed food and clothing. Underground newspapers circulated, carrying both news from the outside world and messages of solidarity. Some Poles, at great personal risk, helped Jewish neighbors hide valuables or secure false papers. These acts of quiet defiance were rarely enough to offset the overwhelming machinery of persecution, but they represented an unbroken thread of dignity. They also preserved a sense of community, however fragile, that would prove crucial when the ghettos were established. By late 1940, the shape of things to come was unmistakable. In Warsaw, Krakow, and Lodz, entire neighborhoods were sealed off with barbed wire or brick walls, marking the beginning of formal ghettos. The Nazis claimed these were temporary measures to control disease or manage populations, but in reality they were the next stage of isolation and destruction. Once enclosed, communities would be easier to exploit, starve, and eventually deport. The legal framework for these measures had already been laid during the previous year of incremental persecution. Now, what had been dispersed across towns and villages was concentrated behind walls. It is important to see this period not as a series of random outrages but as a coherent strategy. The Nazis were building an infrastructure of annihilation in stages. First came identification, then dispossession, then segregation. Each step was presented as a practical necessity but served an ideological end: the erasure of Jews from the life of Poland. The gradual nature of the process lulled many into thinking it might stop or reverse. Instead, it gathered momentum, preparing the way for the far deadlier policies of 1941 and beyond. For listeners today, this chapter is unsettling not only for its cruelty but for its banality. Many of the tools used, badges, permits, confiscations, councils, were bureaucratic. They were implemented by clerks, policemen, and minor officials, not just SS men with guns. This bureaucratic face of persecution reminds us that genocide does not always begin with mass shootings or gas chambers. It begins with paperwork, with rules that define who belongs and who does not, who may eat and who must starve. In Poland between 1939 and 1940, those rules were already rewriting reality, turning neighbors into outcasts and outcasts into victims. As you drift into the story, picture a city street where the shop signs have changed, the people you once greeted are wearing armbands, and familiar houses are being emptied one by one. Picture the sound of boots on cobblestones, the notices posted on walls announcing new restrictions, the quiet resilience of families still lighting candles or teaching children in secret. This was the climate in which the ghettos would soon arise, a climate not of sudden catastrophe but of slow, relentless constriction. Chapter 4: Life Behind the Walls. The creation of the ghettos. When the first barbed wire fences went up around Jewish neighborhoods in late 1940, few could grasp what they truly meant. For centuries, Polish towns and cities had been home to vibrant Jewish communities. Bustling markets, synagogues echoing with prayer, cafes, schools, and libraries. Now, overnight, these same neighborhoods were transformed into prisons. The Nazi occupiers called them residential districts, but everyone soon used the word that would define an era: ghetto. This was not a new term in Jewish history, but its meaning in occupied Poland was unlike anything before: mass confinement on a scale never seen. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest. By November 1940, more than 350,000 Jews were trapped behind its walls, a number that would swell as deportations from surrounding towns increased. Krakow, Lodz, Lublin, Białystok, each had its own version, some large, some small, all alike in their intent: to isolate Jews completely from the surrounding population. Brick walls topped with broken glass or barbed wire, guarded gates, and armed patrols made escape nearly impossible. Entry and exit permits were rare and risky. Inside, life quickly became a struggle not just for dignity but for survival. Conditions deteriorated almost immediately. Housing was grossly overcrowded. Families who had once lived in modest apartments were crammed together with strangers. In Warsaw, space per person averaged less than 3 square meters. Entire families shared single rooms, often without running water. Sanitation collapsed. Latrines overflowed, garbage piled up, and disease spread with terrifying speed. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery became endemic. German authorities used these outbreaks as propaganda, claiming they proved the necessity of segregation, while deliberately withholding medical supplies to worsen the crisis. Food was the weapon most commonly wielded. Official rations for Jews were set at starvation levels, often under 200 calories a day compared to more than 2,000 for Germans. Bread was adulterated with sawdust or potato peels. Meat was non-existent. People smuggled food from the outside at enormous risk. Children became the main couriers, slipping through holes in fences or bribing guards with trinkets. Smuggling networks sprang up, often organized by underground groups or simply desperate families. Without these clandestine supplies, tens of thousands would have died even sooner. Yet the Germans exploited smuggling too, extracting bribes and confiscating goods, turning hunger into a tool of control. Daily life behind the walls had a paradoxical quality. Amid hunger and disease, people tried to maintain routines. Schools operated in secret, teachers working without books or chalk. Theaters, cabarets, and orchestras performed in basements, offering brief moments of escape. Religious services continued, sometimes openly, sometimes underground. Artists sketched, musicians played, writers kept diaries. These efforts were not trivial. They were acts of defiance, proof that even under the most crushing conditions, a community could assert its humanity. In the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, Emanuel Ringelblum organized the Oynegschab's Archive, a secret project to document daily life, collect testimonies, and preserve evidence for the future. This archive, buried in milk cans and tin boxes, would later become one of the most important records of the Holocaust. The Judenräte within the ghettos faced unbearable decisions. They were ordered to distribute food, allocate housing, and enforce German decrees, including deportation lists. Some leaders, like Adam Czerniako in Warsaw, tried to shield their communities but were ultimately powerless against the machinery of death. Czerniako's suicide in 1942, after being ordered to hand over thousands of children for deportation, became a tragic symbol of this moral trap. Other council members collaborated more readily, believing that obedience might save a remnant. History would judge them harshly, but at the time there were no good choices, only gradations of catastrophe. Even under these crushing circumstances, resistance began to take shape. In the early ghetto years, it was mostly nonviolent: smuggling, secret education, underground newspapers. Youth groups formed networks to share information from the outside world. Some began to stockpile weapons, though this was extremely dangerous and often forbidden by their elders, who feared collective reprisals. Yet the very act of surviving each day, of maintaining cultural and religious life, was itself a form of resistance. The ghettos were designed to dehumanize, but many refused to surrender their identity. For many Poles living outside the walls, the ghettos were a grim spectacle. Some sympathized, risking their lives to smuggle food or hide Jews. Others took advantage, profiting from black market trade or denouncing fugitives. The walls not only divided Jews from non-Jews but also exposed the moral fault lines of occupied society. German propaganda worked to widen these divides, portraying Jews as carriers of disease or as profiteers, even as the occupiers themselves orchestrated the misery. The ghettos also served a logistical purpose for the Nazis. They concentrated the Jewish population, making it easier to exploit their labor and eventually to deport them en masse. Workshops inside the ghettos produced uniforms, boots, and military supplies. Some Jews hoped that this labor would ensure survival, believing that their usefulness might spare them. The Nazis encouraged this illusion, issuing work permits and promising exemptions. But these hopes would prove tragically unfounded when deportations to extermination camps began as night fell in the ghettos. The atmosphere was a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and a strange kind of normalcy. Families gathered around candles or makeshift stoves. Children whispered lessons or prayers. Adults discussed rumors of war and rescue. Beyond the walls, the city continued, trams rattling by, churches ringing bells. Inside, time seemed frozen. For many, the ghetto was not yet understood as a prelude to death but as a place of waiting, a limbo where survival might be possible if one endured long enough. That illusion would soon be shattered. Imagine drifting to sleep with these images. Narrow streets crowded with makeshift carts, children darting through holes in fences with smuggled bread, an orchestra playing Schubert in a candlelit basement, diaries being buried in secret caches. This was life behind the walls, a blend of horror and resilience, of despair and defiance, suspended on the edge of a catastrophe still to come. By the spring of 1941, the ghettos had become a grim fixture of occupied Poland, not temporary enclosures but enduring prisons. The daily struggle for food, warmth, and dignity intensified, and with it came a new kind of psychological pressure. The walls did not merely separate, they crushed hope, making time feel endless yet uncertain. Each day brought rumors, deportations, shootings, new regulations, and no one knew what was true. This climate of fear was part of the design. The occupiers wanted not only to confine Jewish communities but to break their spirit long before the next stage of extermination. Hunger and disease were now constant companions. In Warsaw alone, more than 80,000 people died of starvation and illness between 1940 and mid-1942. Corpses lay on the sidewalks, sometimes covered with newspapers, sometimes ignored. Orphan children wandered in rags, their bellies swollen. Yet even amid such suffering, networks of care persisted. Soup kitchens operated by underground groups tried to feed the most vulnerable. Secret medical clinics treated the sick with whatever supplies they could scavenge. In the Lodz Ghetto, Dr. Janusz Korczak ran an orphanage, refusing offers to save himself so that he could stay with his children. His devotion became a symbol of selfless courage, remembered long after his death during the deportations of 1942. Work became another instrument of survival and exploitation. The Nazis established workshops inside the ghettos to produce goods for the German war effort: textiles, shoes, uniforms, even toys. Those with work permits received slightly larger rations and believed they had a chance to live. This belief was cruelly manipulated. In the Lodz Ghetto, for example, the Jewish leader Chaim Rumkowski promoted the slogan, "Give me your labor and I will give you bread," hoping that productivity might protect the community. But when deportations began, work permits offered no real security. Entire factories were emptied and their workers shipped to death camps. The illusion of safety bought time for some but spared few. Despite everything, cultural life did not vanish. Writers continued to record events in diaries and chronicles, risking death to hide them. Children attended clandestine classes, reciting poetry or learning arithmetic in cellars. Musicians played concerts, sometimes for a handful of listeners, sometimes for hundreds crammed into a hall. These acts may seem small, but in an environment designed to reduce people to mere bodies, they affirmed humanity. Emanuel Ringelblum's Oynegschab's archive captured not only statistics and decrees but jokes, songs, menus, and children's drawings, a portrait of a community refusing to disappear without leaving a trace. Resistance within the ghettos was initially quiet but increasingly organized. Youth movements such as Has Homer Hatzer and Dror maintained networks to smuggle arms, gather intelligence, and plan escapes. Some members fled to join partisan units in the forests, though this was perilous and often met with hostility from local populations. Others prepared for the possibility of armed revolt even when success seemed impossible. These early preparations would later culminate in uprisings like the one in Warsaw in 1943, but the seeds were planted during these grim years when survival itself was an act of defiance. Relations with the outside world remained complex. The walls physically separated Jews from non-Jews, but commerce and smuggling created points of contact. Polish children risked death to pass bread through cracks in the walls. Some families hid Jews in their homes or provided false papers. Others exploited the desperate situation, charging exorbitant prices or denouncing fugitives to the Gestapo. German propaganda worked to deepen these divisions, spreading rumors and portraying the ghettos as centers of criminality. Yet even under such conditions, bonds of friendship and solidarity sometimes crossed the barriers. By late 1941, The ghettos had taken on a paradoxical appearance. On the surface there was activity, markets, workshops, schools, but underneath lay exhaustion, loss, and a growing sense of doom. People whispered about mass shootings in the east, about pits filled with bodies, about resettlement actions from which no one returned. Few could imagine the scale of what was coming, but many sensed that the ghettos were not an end in themselves but a holding pen for something far worse. This foreboding seeped into letters, diaries, and conversations, giving the final months before mass deportations an air of suspended catastrophe. Nighttime in the ghettos was especially haunting. After curfew, the streets went silent except for patrols. Families huddled in their rooms, listening for footsteps. Smugglers crept through sewers or over roofs, carrying flour, potatoes, or contraband news. Children dreamed of open fields, of bread, of escape. Some adults clung to faith, lighting Sabbath candles or whispering prayers. Others lost hope entirely. Yet even in despair, there was an undercurrent of will to live, of stubborn refusal to give up one's name, one's story, one's soul. As you imagine this world, picture narrow streets where life pulses in spite of everything. Children learning by candlelight, musicians playing in cellars, workers stitching uniforms while rumors of death circulate outside the walls. Picture the ache of hunger and the fragile dignity of a community documenting its own destruction for the future. The ghettos were not just prisons. They were crucibles of suffering and resilience, where ordinary people faced extraordinary choices and where the next, deadliest phase of the Holocaust was already being prepared. By early 1942, the ghettos had become a vast holding system for a population already weakened by hunger, disease, and despair. To the Nazis, however, this was only a preparatory stage. In secret meetings and coded cables, they were moving from the policy of forced labor and segregation to a policy of total extermination. This shift was formalized at the WWII conference in January 1942, where high-ranking officials coordinated what they called the final solution of the Jewish question. For Poland's Jews, this meant that the walls of the ghettos were not to be their last enclosure but their final stop before a journey to death. The instrument chosen for this mass murder in occupied Poland was Operation Reinhard, named after Reinhard Heydrich, the SS leader who helped plan the genocide. Under Operation Reinhard, 3 main extermination camps were built: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These were not like Auschwitz at that time, which still combined forced labor with killing. They were pure death factories, designed solely to murder as many people as quickly and efficiently as possible. Each camp was located near a railway line, hidden in forests or rural areas, close enough to the ghettos for easy transport but far enough from major cities to conceal their true purpose. Belzec was the first to begin operations in March 1942. It consisted of a small number of barracks, a railway siding, and gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Victims arrived in sealed freight cars after days without food or water. On arrival, they were told they would be disinfected and sent to work. Men and women were separated. Valuables and clothing were taken. Within hours, they were herded into gas chambers powered by carbon monoxide engines, killed, and buried in mass graves. Very few survived to tell the tale. By the end of 1942, more than 400,000 Jews had been murdered at Belzec, most from the Lublin and Lvov districts. Sobibor, operational from May 1942, followed a similar model but incorporated lessons learned from Belzec to increase killing speed. Gas chambers were larger, processing thousands a day. The camp was ringed with barbed wire and minefields, guarded by a small staff of Germans and Ukrainian auxiliaries. Victims came from across Poland and also from other countries: Czechoslovakia, France, the Netherlands. The deception was meticulous. Flower beds outside barracks, signs for bathhouses, even fake railway schedules. All was designed to minimize panic until the very last moment. In this theater of death, every detail served the goal of efficiency. Treblinka, the third Operation Reinhard camp, opened in July 1942 and quickly became the deadliest of all. Located northeast of Warsaw, it was the endpoint for Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto and many other areas. These gas chambers could kill thousands at once. Bodies were initially buried in pits but later burned on giant pyres to erase evidence. Treblinka's operation was so rapid that in just over a year more than 800,000 people were murdered there, making it the second deadliest killing center after Auschwitz. Like the other Reinhard camps, Treblinka had virtually no permanent prisoners. Most were killed within hours of arrival. Only small work details were kept alive temporarily to sort belongings or maintain the camp. What distinguished these camps from earlier mass shootings or ghettos was their industrialized nature. They were not improvised massacres but planned facilities with timetables, quotas, and assembly line processes. Transports were scheduled with railway precision. Luggage was labeled and sorted. Hair, gold teeth, and even ashes were collected for reuse. The perpetrators were few in number, often fewer than 30 Germans per camp, relying on local auxiliaries and the machinery of the state to deliver victims. This system allowed a small cadre of killers to destroy entire communities without large-scale military operations. The deportations from the ghettos to the Reinhard camps began in the spring and summer of 1942. Notices would appear ordering people to report for resettlement to the east. Sometimes selections were made in the streets. Sometimes whole neighborhoods were surrounded at dawn. People were driven to railway stations or assembly points, beaten, and crammed into freight cars. Each car held 80 to 100 people with no water, toilets, or ventilation. Many died en route from heat, cold, or suffocation. Those who arrived alive were usually dead within hours. The pace was staggering. In a few weeks during the summer of 1942, nearly 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto alone were sent to Treblinka. Inside the ghettos, the impact was devastating. Families were torn apart overnight. Parents hid children in cellars or attics, hoping to save at least one. Underground groups tried to warn people but were often disbelieved. The idea of purpose-built death camps seemed impossible. Even those who heard credible reports often faced an unbearable choice: stay with family and risk deportation, or try to escape and survive alone. German authorities manipulated these choices, promising exemptions for workers or council members, only to revoke them later. Terror and deception worked hand in hand to keep order as entire communities were emptied. For the Nazis, Operation Reinhard was not only about murder but about plunder. Entire trains of clothing, shoes, and valuables were sent back to Germany. Hair from victims was used for felt and textiles. Gold from teeth was melted down. This systematic robbery financed part of the war effort and enriched individuals in the SS. The scale of theft was so vast that it required its own bureaucracy, with warehouses, inventories, and auctions. Thus, genocide became intertwined with economic exploitation, making the final solution not just a crime of hatred but also of greed. Imagine the atmosphere of Poland in 1942 as these trains rolled east. Sealed boxcars moving day and night, empty ghettos, rumors of disappearance spreading like wildfire. In towns that had been majority Jewish, silence settled over streets once filled with music, trade, and prayer. Shops stood shuttered, synagogues empty, schools closed. The machinery of death was not just destroying people but erasing entire worlds. Yet even amid this devastation, Seeds of resistance were sprouting, as survivors of deportations began to bring back word of what awaited at the camps. Those seeds would soon grow into uprisings and escapes, though at unimaginable cost. The deportations and mass killings of 1942 marked the escalation of a systematic genocide that transformed occupied Poland into the epicenter of the Holocaust. By mid-year, the Reinhard camps were operating at full capacity. The Nazis had perfected a horrifying efficiency. Entire communities could be erased within weeks. Warsaw, Lodz, Lublin, and smaller ghettos emptied in succession, leaving behind abandoned streets, crumbling synagogues, and a population reduced to survivors who were physically weakened and psychologically traumatized. These survivors witnessed the unimaginable: the sudden disappearance of friends, neighbors, and family, often without any concrete explanation. In the ghettos, the psychological toll of Operation Reinhard was immense. Families who remained hidden or were temporarily exempted from deportation lived under constant fear. Children were separated from parents and parents from children. Escape was nearly impossible. The walls, barbed wire, and patrolling guards kept the majority contained. Rumors of gas chambers circulated but were difficult for most to believe. The reality of industrialized killing was beyond comprehension for those who had known only oppression, forced labor, and starvation. Yet underground networks and observant residents gradually pieced together reports of what awaited on the other side of the fences. The Nazis also used deception to facilitate compliance. Victims were told they were being resettled for labor in the East. On arrival at the camps, they were instructed to undress, leave their valuables behind, and enter what appeared to be shower rooms. All of this was carefully orchestrated to minimize resistance and to preserve order. Those who questioned the process or resisted were shot immediately. The psychological manipulation was a key component of the machinery of death. It allowed the Nazis to kill hundreds of thousands without the chaos that might have disrupted the operation. While the Reinhard camps claimed the largest number of Polish Jewish victims, they were not the only sites of mass murder. Parallel programs of mass shootings were carried out in the countryside by the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads that had been operating since 1941 in eastern Poland. Villages with Jewish populations were targeted, and entire communities were executed in nearby forests. In some cases, these killings preceded deportations to camps, serving as brutal tests of German personnel and as warnings to the remaining population. Eyewitness accounts describe men, women, and children marched to pits, forced to dig their own graves, and then shot. The screams and cries echoed through forests, leaving survivors and witnesses traumatized. These mass shootings, combined with the industrialized killings of the camps, represent the dual mechanism of early extermination: localized, immediate violence paired with centralized, systematic murder. The logistics of Operation Reinhard were staggering. Railways were scheduled meticulously. Trains carried hundreds of people at a time. The Nazis employed a small number of Germans along with local collaborators from Ukraine and other territories to manage operations. Everything, from the sorting of clothes to the collection of valuables, was bureaucratically managed. This assembly line approach was unprecedented in its scope and efficiency. It allowed a relatively small number of perpetrators to kill hundreds of thousands without requiring mass mobilization of troops. This cold, calculated system made the Holocaust in Poland unique in its methodical cruelty. Inside the ghettos, resistance took multiple forms, ranging from passive to active. Some attempted to hide children or forge identity papers, while others organized clandestine schools or cultural activities to maintain morale. Smuggling networks expanded, bringing in food, information, and news of the outside world. Small groups even began to acquire weapons, planning uprisings and escape routes. These efforts, while limited in scope compared to the scale of the deportations, reflected the resilience of communities that refused to be completely dehumanized. They were acts of courage in a world designed to extinguish both life and spirit. One of the most remarkable examples of resistance during this period was the Warsaw Ghetto's underground network. Young people collected information about deportations, hid valuables, and even recorded eyewitness accounts of what was happening in the camps. The Unimaginable archive, organized by Emanuel Ringelblum, preserved diaries, letters, and documents, ensuring that future generations would understand the scale of what was happening. In doing so, these individuals demonstrated that even under conditions of extreme oppression, human dignity, creativity, and the desire for remembrance could persist. It was an act of intellectual and moral resistance against the machinery of death. Operation Reinhard also marked a turning point in Nazi ideology and policy. Before 1942, the Holocaust had been characterized by selective killings, mass shootings, and ghettoization. After 1942, extermination became industrialized, bureaucratic, and systematic. Every detail, from transport timetables to the disposal of ashes, was meticulously planned. The ghettos, once prisons, became supply points for the death camps. Jewish labor was exploited to the last degree, then replaced by death. The efficiency and scale of these operations foreshadowed the horrors of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which would soon eclipse the Reinhard camps in both size and lethality. Picture, if you will, the train stations of occupied Poland during this period. Freight cars packed with families, the sound of children crying, the old and sick unable to stand, the clatter of the rails carrying them toward gas chambers. Streets emptied as communities were systematically torn apart. The silence that followed in the ghettos was broken only by the whisper of underground networks and the occasional act of defiance. The machinery of death had begun its full operation, and Poland had become the center of one of history's darkest chapters. Yet amid this darkness, threads of resistance, documentation, and human solidarity persisted, laying the foundation for memory and testimony in the years to come. Chapter 6: The Jewish Resistance. Courage Amidst Catastrophe. By 1942, the reality of the Holocaust in Poland had reached a point that few could deny. The ghettos, the deportations, and the death camps had transformed communities that had once thrived for centuries into landscapes of fear, hunger, and death. Yet even in this darkest chapter, acts of courage and resistance emerged, reminding the world that human spirit can endure under extreme oppression. These acts were varied, ranging from smuggling and education to armed revolt, and reflected the determination of people who refused to surrender entirely to Nazi domination. Resistance often began in the most basic and pragmatic ways. Food smuggling was not just a matter of survival but a quiet defiance against the rules imposed by the occupiers. Young children and teenagers became messengers, slipping through cracks in fences, crawling under barbed wire, or bribing guards to carry bread, potatoes, and sometimes news from the outside world. These small acts, repeated countless times, saved lives and maintained morale. Families depended on these networks, which often involved neighbors or underground organizations coordinating routes, schedules, and hiding places. Even the simple act of sharing a loaf of bread became a form of rebellion in an environment designed to starve and humiliate. Cultural resistance was another avenue of defiance. Despite hunger and overcrowding, Jews in the ghettos sought to preserve their identity through secret schools, religious services, and artistic endeavors. In Warsaw, teachers organized clandestine classrooms for children, teaching basic literacy, history, and even foreign languages, often in basements or hidden apartments. Religious leaders, though constantly monitored, held secret services and taught traditions that reinforced community cohesion. Artists sketched scenes of daily life, musicians played on makeshift instruments, and writers documented everything, from hunger and fear to small moments of humor and hope. These activities were acts of defiance because they maintained human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. One of the most remarkable forms of intellectual resistance was the Unimaginable archive in Warsaw, organized by historian Emanuel Ringelblum. This secret archive collected diaries, letters, official notices, photographs, and oral testimonies from the ghetto's residents. The goal was to document life under Nazi rule for future generations, preserving evidence of atrocities even as daily survival remained uncertain. Participants risked execution to gather this material. The archive became a symbol of intellectual courage, a testament to the belief that the truth of human experience could survive even when the community itself was under threat of annihilation. Armed resistance began to take shape as the full scale of the extermination became clear. Groups such as the Jewish Combat Organization, OB, and the Jewish Military Union, ZW, in Warsaw trained in secret, stockpiled weapons, and prepared for uprisings. These young fighters understood that they could not prevent the Nazi machinery of death entirely, but they could resist symbolically and strategically. They believed that it was better to die fighting than to submit passively to extermination. Preparations involved gathering explosives, smuggling arms into the ghetto, and training youth in clandestine facilities. This underground military activity became the backbone for future uprisings that would shock the world with their bravery. In the forests surrounding Poland, Jewish partisans began to emerge. Escaping deportation, they formed small units in wooded regions, surviving on foraged food, hunting, and supplies smuggled from sympathetic villagers. Partisan groups carried out sabotage missions against German supply lines, attacked collaborators, and rescued others who had fled the ghettos. Life in the forest was harsh and often deadly, but for many, it represented freedom and the ability to actively resist rather than merely survive. These partisans also collected intelligence on Nazi operations, which would later inform broader resistance movements and historical records. Resistance was not only physical or intellectual but also moral. Some council members, despite being forced to enforce Nazi directives, took steps to save as many lives as possible. They falsified lists, delayed deportations, or arranged hiding places for vulnerable individuals. Neighbors and sympathetic Poles played a crucial role as well, risking imprisonment or execution to hide Jewish families, provide food, or forge identity papers. These acts demonstrate the complex moral landscape of occupied Poland, where choices were fraught with danger but could preserve life and dignity. Life in the ghettos was brutal, yet resistance infused daily survival with meaning. Children attended secret schools, learning not only academics but the history and culture of their people. Adults engaged in underground journalism, sharing news of atrocities and documenting events in meticulous detail. Even music, poetry, and storytelling became tools of resilience, providing hope and continuity. Every act of preservation, whether a hidden prayer, a buried diary, or a smuggled loaf of bread, was a form of defiance against the Nazis' attempt to annihilate both life and identity. As deportations to extermination camps intensified, these resistance networks became lifelines. Smuggling networks expanded, underground education continued, and partisans rescued escapees. Every act, large or small, challenged the Nazi narrative that Jews were powerless. While the overwhelming machinery of death could not be stopped by these efforts alone, resistance preserved human dignity, saved lives, and documented truth for future generations. It showed that even under conditions designed for total submission, courage, ingenuity, and solidarity could survive. Imagine the ghettos of Warsaw or Lodz. Cramped, dark rooms where children memorize lessons by candlelight, musicians play in basements, and young fighters practice in secret corridors. Outside, the threat of deportation looms, yet networks of smuggling, hiding, and intelligence weave an invisible web of defiance. This was the heartbeat of Jewish resistance in occupied Poland, a mixture of courage, hope, and determination that would culminate in acts remembered as heroic for centuries. As 1942 progressed into 1943, Jewish resistance in occupied Poland grew in scope, complexity, and determination, despite the near-impossible odds. While daily survival in the ghettos remained the primary concern for most, a growing awareness of the extermination taking place in camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec galvanized segments of the population into organized defiance. The moral imperative to resist, combined with the instinct to survive, led to a spectrum of responses ranging from clandestine education and cultural preservation to armed revolt and partisan warfare. In Warsaw, the Jewish Combat Organization (OB) became the epicenter of armed resistance planning. Formed by a coalition of socialist, Zionist, and communist youth movements, the OB recognized that resistance would be largely symbolic at first, given the disparity of power. Training and organization took place in basements, attics, and hidden cellars, where youths practiced with improvised weapons and learned the basics of sabotage. Small cells gathered intelligence, documented deportations, and distributed underground leaflets to keep hope alive among ghetto residents. Each act of resistance was a calculated risk. Discovery often meant instant execution, but the members pressed on, driven by a determination to assert humanity in the face of annihilation. Simultaneously, the Jewish Military Union (ZW), predominantly associated with right-wing Zionist groups, focused on paramilitary organization. Members secured smuggled firearms, sometimes from sympathetic Poles or underground networks, and trained in secrecy. Both the OB and ZW coordinated intelligence gathering to monitor German troop movements and prepare for the inevitable moment when resistance would become open combat. These early preparations laid the foundation for uprisings that would later define Jewish courage and defiance, particularly in Warsaw, where the 1943 Ghetto Uprising became a historical symbol of heroism against overwhelming oppression. Partisan groups outside the ghettos also became increasingly active. Escaped Jews and small units operating in forests engaged in sabotage missions, ambushing German convoys, derailing trains, and disrupting supply lines. These groups faced extraordinary difficulties: scarce resources, harsh weather, limited food, and hostile terrain. Yet the forest offered a form of mobility and relative autonomy, enabling survivors to continue fighting while also rescuing those fleeing deportation. The partisans also worked to maintain lines of communication with the ghettos, bringing news, supplies, and moral support, further reinforcing the network of resistance. Resistance within the ghettos was not limited to armed or clandestine activities. Moral and cultural preservation was equally vital. Teachers continued secret schooling, emphasizing Jewish history, language, and religion, ensuring that the next generation retained knowledge of their identity despite systemic attempts at erasure. Musicians, actors, and writers staged performances, composed music, and chronicled daily life in the shadows. Diaries, letters, and manuscripts documented hunger, deportations, brutality, and moments of quiet heroism. The Unimaginable archive in Warsaw, perhaps the most famous of these efforts, collected first-hand accounts and records that would survive as a testament to the lives lost and the courage of those who endured. These acts of intellectual resistance were a defiance of the Nazis' goal to erase not just lives but memory itself. Even acts of compassion were resistance. Families hid children in attics, basements, or with sympathetic neighbors. Individuals provided forged identity papers or arranged temporary refuge outside the ghettos. Each action risked execution, yet these efforts saved thousands of lives and reinforced community cohesion. Survival became a collaborative effort, weaving networks of trust, secrecy, and courage that strengthened the ghetto's fragile moral fabric. In this sense, resistance was both practical and symbolic. It protected life where possible, preserved dignity, and maintained the spirit of a people under siege. The psychological aspect of resistance was equally important. The knowledge that one could act, even in small ways, countered the despair that the Nazis sought to instill. Secret schools, underground newspapers, and hidden archives gave individuals purpose and structure in a world designed for chaos and terror. Each completed task, each successful smuggling operation, and each document preserved for the future represented a small victory, reinforcing resilience and collective identity. These acts of defiance were crucial for morale, offering hope and a sense of agency in an environment where control and oppression were total. The culmination of these efforts was seen in the uprisings that erupted in 1943. While large-scale revolts like the Warsaw Ghetto uprising would come later, the groundwork was established through these years of clandestine preparation. These earlier forms of resistance, smuggling, education, documentation, and small-scale sabotage, created a network of skills, knowledge, and organization that enabled the later armed rebellions. Even in the face of near-certain death, the knowledge that one could resist, document, and preserve identity infused life with purpose and provided a foundation for historical memory. As you imagine the ghettos and forests of occupied Poland during this period, picture a landscape where danger lurks around every corner, yet human ingenuity and courage shine through. Children carry bread past guards, teachers write lessons by candlelight, partisans plan ambushes in dense forests, and young fighters rehearse in basements. Each act, small or large, constitutes resistance, a reaffirmation of humanity in the shadow of annihilation. This resistance, both moral and physical, intellectual and practical, is a defining aspect of the Holocaust in Poland. It reminds us that even under the most extreme oppression, courage, solidarity, and the desire to preserve human dignity can endure. Chapter 7: The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Defiance against the odds. By early 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto had become a focal point of both suffering and resistance. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had already been deported to Treblinka, Sobibor, and other death camps, leaving those who remained trapped behind the ghetto walls with few resources and dwindling hope. The surviving population faced starvation, disease, and constant harassment from German forces. Yet, amid this despair, a spirit of defiance was growing, a determination to resist not only for survival but for dignity, identity, and memory. The seeds planted in the clandestine resistance networks now began to bear fruit. The idea of armed resistance in Warsaw was unprecedented in scale. The Jewish Combat Organization, OB, and the Jewish Military Union, ZW, had been quietly preparing for months, smuggling weapons, building bunkers, and training youth in clandestine facilities. These groups represented a diverse array of political affiliations: socialists, Zionists, and communists united by a shared goal of defiance. Their members knew that, given the overwhelming strength of the German forces, survival was unlikely. Yet they believed that resistance was a moral imperative. Fighting, even if it led to death, was preferable to passive submission to systematic extermination. The immediate catalyst for the uprising was the German plan to deport the remaining Jews of Warsaw to Treblinka. By April 1943, rumors and intelligence had confirmed that the Germans intended to complete the Ghettos' cleansing operation. Leaders of the resistance understood that if they did not act, their community would vanish entirely. In basements and hidden rooms, they stockpiled weapons and explosives. Homemade grenades, pistols, rifles, and a few smuggled machine guns were assembled. Underground tunnels were expanded to allow movement and communication between bunkers. Even though their arsenal was small compared to the German military, the fighters relied on surprise, knowledge of the urban terrain, and sheer determination that as deportations intensified, the resistance launched its first organized attacks. On April 19, 1943, German forces entered the ghetto in force, expecting a passive population. Instead, they were met with gunfire from hidden fighters, barricades erected across streets, and Molotov cocktails hurled from upper windows. The fighters utilized the maze-like layout of the ghetto to their advantage. Narrow alleyways, hidden bunkers, and underground passages allowed small groups to strike quickly and disappear. Though the Germans had tanks, heavy weapons, and thousands of troops, they were initially unprepared for such coordinated urban guerrilla tactics. The uprising lasted for several weeks, longer than the Germans had anticipated. Resistance fighters held out in bunkers and fortified buildings, engaging in hit-and-run attacks that inflicted casualties on the occupiers. Civilians supported the fighters by providing food, information, and medical aid, creating a network of solidarity even under extreme conditions. The psychological impact of this defiance extended beyond the ghetto itself. German officers were shocked by the determination of a population they had assumed could be subdued without resistance. International observers and underground press outside the ghetto circulated reports, highlighting the extraordinary courage displayed by the fighters. Life during the uprising was a mixture of chaos, ingenuity, and resilience. Residents moved between hiding places, often under bombardment. Messages were carried through tunnels and courtyards. Children and the elderly were hidden in secret rooms or attics, while young fighters engaged in combat. Despite constant danger, cultural and religious life persisted wherever possible. In some bunkers, prayers continued, songs were sung, and clandestine education maintained the threads of identity. These acts reinforced the idea that resistance was not only physical but also spiritual and moral. It was a statement that life, culture, and memory could not be erased, even under the threat of annihilation. The Germans escalated their response using flamethrowers, heavy artillery, and coordinated raids to root out resistance fighters. Buildings were systematically set on fire, and entire blocks were demolished. Many fighters were killed in these attacks, while others were captured and executed. Yet, despite the overwhelming force, the resistance managed to prolong the struggle, demonstrating remarkable tactical skill and extraordinary courage. The uprising, although ultimately crushed militarily, became a symbol of defiance against the machinery of genocide. It proved that, even in the face of almost certain death, people could assert their humanity and resist oppression. Throughout the uprising, communication between resistance groups and the outside world was vital. Couriers carried messages through secret routes, alerting Polish underground organizations, partisan units, and sympathetic civilians. Supplies were smuggled into the ghetto wherever possible. While external support was limited, these connections reinforced morale and maintained the notion that the ghetto struggle was part of a broader resistance against Nazi occupation. Every act of defiance, from firing a weapon to preserving a diary, contributed to a narrative of courage that would echo through history. Imagine the streets of Warsaw during this period. Smoke rising from burning buildings, the sounds of gunfire echoing through alleyways, resistance fighters darting between barricades, and civilians assisting with food and intelligence. Despite the terror, a spirit of defiance permeated the air. The fighters understood that they were facing impossible odds, yet they refused to surrender without a struggle. This combination of courage, ingenuity, and moral determination became the defining characteristic of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a moment where the human spirit, even in its most vulnerable, refused to be extinguished. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising continued for nearly a month, from April 19th to mid-May 1943, leaving a lasting imprint on history as an extraordinary example of courage in the face of annihilation. While German forces ultimately suppressed the resistance, the uprising demonstrated that even an oppressed, starving, and outnumbered population could organize, fight, and resist systematically. The defenders knew the odds were impossible. They also knew that submission meant certain death. By choosing resistance, they affirmed not only their own humanity but also the dignity of their entire community. German forces deployed a full-scale military response to crush the ghetto. Elite SS units, reinforced by auxiliary police, systematically combed through the streets, burning buildings, demolishing bunkers, and executing anyone found hiding. Flamethrowers became the symbol of terror, turning entire blocks into infernos. Smoke and fire consumed apartments, while cries of women and children echoed through the narrow streets. Despite these overwhelming tactics, small groups of fighters continued to resist, using hidden passages and improvised weapons to evade capture. Their knowledge of the ghetto's labyrinthine streets and tunnels allowed them to stage surprise attacks, inflict casualties, and prolong the conflict far longer than the Germans had anticipated. One of the most notable acts of heroism occurred in the so-called Murinów district, where a handful of fighters managed to hold German forces at bay for days, allowing civilians to escape or hide in secret bunkers. These urban skirmishes were characterized by extreme improvisation. Fighters constructed barricades from rubble, set up ambush points on staircases, and tunneled between buildings. They used Molotov cocktails, pistols, and smuggled rifles against heavily armed soldiers. Despite the disparity in firepower, their resistance was effective enough to cause frustration and surprise among German commanders. In one report, a German officer admitted that he had underestimated the tenacity and organization of the ghetto fighters. While the armed struggle is often the focus, the human experience of the uprising extended far beyond combat. Families lived in constant terror, moving from one hiding place to another. Children were hidden in basements or attics, often with neighbors risking their lives to protect them. Adults relied on underground networks to obtain food, clothing, and information. Communication between bunkers was vital. Messages were carried under gunfire through tunnels, courtyards, and even sewer lines. These efforts required careful coordination, courage, and the willingness to risk death for others. In every corner of the ghetto, acts of solidarity and selflessness unfolded alongside acts of combat, forming a complex tapestry of resistance. The uprising also highlighted the moral dilemmas faced by the Jewish councils, Judenrat. Some council members participated in the resistance, secretly aiding fighters by providing information, resources, or logistical support. Others were paralyzed by fear or coerced by German threats, creating tension within the community. Yet even amid these divisions, the collective determination to resist prevailed, underscoring the resilience of a people whose very existence was under threat. The uprising was not merely a military confrontation. It was a struggle for survival, identity, and human dignity against a system designed to erase both. As German forces systematically destroyed the ghetto, they employed a combination of terror and methodical tactics to eradicate resistance. Buildings were set ablaze, tunnels collapsed, and fighters were hunted relentlessly. Despite these overwhelming forces, pockets of resistance continued, often to the last remaining individuals. The fighting was both symbolic and practical, delaying German operations and allowing civilians to survive temporarily in hidden bunkers or escape to surrounding areas. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, represented a refusal to accept the fate dictated by the Nazis. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising also inspired resistance beyond the walls. News of the bravery of the fighters reached other ghettos, underground movements, and partisan groups. While the immediate impact could not halt the machinery of death, the moral and psychological resonance was profound. The uprising became a symbol of human dignity and courage, proving that even under extreme oppression, organized resistance was possible. It demonstrated to both contemporaries and future generations that the human spirit could resist annihilation, even when survival seemed unlikely. Ultimately, the uprising ended with the systematic destruction of the ghetto. Buildings were leveled, bunkers blown up, and fighters either killed in combat or captured and executed. Tens of thousands of civilians were deported to Treblinka or other extermination sites. Yet, despite the physical defeat, the uprising left an enduring legacy. It transformed the narrative of victimhood into one of courage and moral resistance. The names of leaders like Mordecai Anielewicz, Marek Edelman, and others became emblematic of the determination to fight, even when facing insurmountable odds. Their courage continues to inspire remembrance, study, and reflection as you picture the streets of Warsaw during the uprising. Imagine a city engulfed in smoke and flames, narrow alleyways where fighters dart from ruin to ruin, and families moving silently from hiding place to hiding place. Hear the gunfire, the cries, the footsteps echoing through the rubble, and sense the extraordinary courage of ordinary people standing against unimaginable terror. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising is a story of defiance that reminds us that even in the darkest moments of history, acts of courage, solidarity, and moral resolve endure. Chapter 8: Life in the Shadows. Hidden Jews and survival outside the ghettos. As the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and Operation Reinhard raged across occupied Poland, a smaller, quieter struggle unfolded beyond the barbed wire walls and the burning streets. Not all Jews remained in ghettos or fell victim to the trains to Treblinka, Sobibor, or Belzec. Thousands fled into forests, hidden attics, and sympathetic Polish homes, living lives suspended between fear and hope. Survival outside the ghettos required ingenuity, courage, and constant vigilance. Every day was a test of endurance, trust, and identity, with the looming threat of betrayal or discovery ever present. For many, hiding began with the simplest acts of ingenuity. Attics, basements, and hidden rooms behind false walls became sanctuaries. Families often relied on sympathetic neighbors, local clergy, or underground organizations to provide food, clothing, and guidance. Sometimes these hideouts were known only to one or two people, while in other cases entire networks coordinated the concealment of dozens of individuals. The risks were extraordinary. Anyone discovered hiding Jews faced execution alongside those they sheltered. Yet, countless Poles accepted this risk, motivated by compassion, morality, or shared resistance against Nazi occupation. In these precarious conditions, trust became a lifeline, but also a source of constant anxiety. One slip, one betrayal, and an entire network could be destroyed in an instant. Children in hiding faced particular challenges. They could not remember the streets they once walked, the schools they once attended, or the playgrounds where laughter had once filled the air. They were required to remain silent during raids, often staying in cramped spaces for hours or days. Yet many displayed remarkable adaptability and courage. Some were disguised as Christian children, learning prayers and customs to blend in with their surroundings. Others memorized new identities, names, and histories, performing them flawlessly when questioned by neighbors, German soldiers, or collaborators. Survival required not just physical endurance but the psychological strength to become someone else while retaining an inner sense of self. Life in the forests became another path to survival. Jews who escaped deportation or massacres often joined partisan groups in dense woodlands, particularly in regions like the WWII forest or the areas around Lublin and the Vistula River. These partisans lived off the land, supplemented by smuggled supplies and aid from sympathetic villagers. Daily life in the forest was harsh. Exposure to the elements, scarcity of food, disease, and constant threat of German patrols made existence precarious. Yet the forest also offered a degree of freedom impossible within the ghettos. Here, survival was coupled with agency. These individuals could actively fight, sabotage, and resist. Partisan groups engaged in attacks on German convoys, ambushed collaborators, and rescued other Jews attempting to flee. In this context, the forest was not merely a hiding place but a center of defiance and hope. The role of the Polish underground and sympathetic civilians was crucial in sustaining life outside the ghettos. Networks like Zgoda, the Council to Aid Jews, coordinated the provision of false identity papers, food, medicine, and shelter. Couriers risked their lives to carry messages and coordinate transfers. Priests, nuns, and ordinary townspeople hid entire families in monasteries, barns, and private homes. These acts of bravery were extraordinary, as discovery often meant death not only for the Jewish fugitives but also for those aiding them. The moral courage required was immense, reflecting the human capacity for empathy and solidarity under extreme circumstances. Despite the protection of sympathetic individuals, the threat of betrayal loomed large. Some neighbors or opportunists denounced hidden Jews for rewards, security, or coercion. German forces and collaborators relied heavily on informants to locate those in hiding. Raids were common, and entire families could be executed or deported as a result of a single tip. Living in hiding required constant vigilance, careful planning, and, often, isolation. Children could not play, adults could not leave without purpose, and silence became a tool of survival. Every day was a negotiation between the natural human need for normalcy and the imperatives of safety. The psychological strain of life in hiding was enormous. Constant fear, limited food, and cramped living conditions created intense stress. Many hid in dark, damp rooms with minimal light, separated from community and family. The isolation affected both adults and children, requiring immense resilience. Yet, in these conditions, individuals found ways to maintain their humanity. They shared stories of the past, taught religious lessons, maintained secret traditions, and nurtured hope for liberation. Every act of memory, every whispered prayer, every hidden celebration was a defiance of the Nazis' attempt to erase identity and culture. Communication between those in hiding and the outside world was vital. Couriers carried messages, food, and news of German movements. This allowed hidden Jews to avoid raids, acquire scarce supplies, and maintain psychological connection to the larger struggle. Underground networks also provided intelligence to partisan groups and, in some cases, facilitated coordinated resistance operations. The collaboration between hidden Jews and these networks exemplifies a complex ecosystem of survival where courage, ingenuity, and solidarity intertwined in life-saving ways. Imagine the hidden rooms, the dense forests, and the secret paths of occupied Poland. Picture children learning prayers and whispers, families rationing every crumb of food, and partisans preparing for attacks under the canopy of trees. Imagine the constant tension between fear and hope, the vigilance required to survive, and the courage that sustained these individuals despite the relentless machinery of death outside. This world of hidden Jews was a shadow of the ghettos, yet it was a crucible of endurance, creativity, and moral resilience. It reminds us that the struggle for survival during the Holocaust was multifaceted, encompassing not only armed revolt, but also everyday acts of courage, secrecy, and unwavering human spirit. As 1943 progressed, survival outside the ghettos became an increasingly complex and dangerous enterprise. Those who escaped deportation or massacres faced a precarious existence that required constant vigilance, creativity, and reliance on networks of trust. Life in hiding was a continuous negotiation between the imperative to remain unseen and the necessity of securing food, medicine, and information. Each day presented a series of challenges that tested endurance, intelligence, and courage to the limits. One of the central challenges was securing sufficient nourishment. Food scarcity was endemic in occupied Poland, and those in hiding had to be exceptionally resourceful. Families rationed every scrap, often living on meager portions of potatoes, bread, or wild greens. Forest-dwelling partisans supplemented their diet with hunting, foraging, and supplies smuggled from sympathetic villages. For those in urban hiding, clandestine food networks became lifelines, with couriers and underground organizations risking their lives to deliver essentials. The act of sharing food, no matter how small, became a profound expression of solidarity and mutual survival in the face of systematic deprivation. Clothing and protection against the elements presented another challenge. Winter in Poland was brutal, with freezing temperatures and heavy snow. Many individuals in hiding had only the clothes they wore when fleeing the ghettos or homes. Underground networks provided wool, blankets, and additional garments whenever possible, often smuggling them from sympathetic civilians or black market sources. In the forests, partisans used animal hides, makeshift shelters, and foraged materials to construct rudimentary protection against cold and exposure. Every layer, every improvised shelter, represented a small victory against the environment and the constant threat of discovery. Maintaining health was equally difficult. Medical care was scarce, and those in hiding could not risk visiting official facilities without exposing themselves. Underground physicians and nurses played a critical role, providing care in secret, treating injuries, infections, and illnesses with limited supplies. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and scurvy were common, exacerbated by malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. Despite these obstacles, survival was often possible through ingenuity, improvisation, and sheer determination. Hidden Jews developed knowledge of herbal remedies, wound care, and hygiene practices that, combined with careful avoidance of German patrols, allowed them to endure conditions designed to destroy them. Education and cultural preservation also continued in secret, even in the most difficult circumstances. Children in hiding were taught in improvised classes, often in basements or attics, learning language, history, and mathematics. Religious instruction was maintained whenever possible, preserving the spiritual and cultural identity that the Nazis sought to erase. Storytelling, Songs and clandestine performances nurtured morale, offering psychological sustenance and a sense of continuity. These acts, seemingly small, reinforced resilience and affirmed humanity under conditions designed to strip individuals of both identity and hope. Partisan groups operating in the forests became hubs of both survival and active resistance. Jewish partisans engaged in sabotage, ambushes, and intelligence gathering, often coordinating with broader Polish underground forces. These actions disrupted German supply lines, diverted attention from deportations, and saved lives by enabling others to escape or hide. Life in the forest was harsh, requiring constant vigilance and adaptability. Food scarcity, exposure to the elements, and the threat of German patrols made every day a challenge. Yet the forest offered a degree of autonomy and opportunity for direct defiance that was impossible within ghettos or urban hiding places. The psychological dimension of hiding was profound. Individuals lived in constant fear, knowing that discovery meant immediate death for themselves and often for those assisting them. Children had to remain silent, adults had to calculate every movement, and communication required extreme caution. Isolation could be psychologically devastating, yet people found ways to maintain hope and community. Shared stories, hidden religious observances, and the creation of secret journals or records became tools for psychological survival, reinforcing identity and purpose in a world designed to destroy both. Collaboration and trust were essential. Networks of sympathetic Poles, clergy, and underground operatives coordinated the concealment, transportation, and sustenance of hidden Jews. Couriers carried messages, organized smuggling operations, and facilitated movement between safe locations. Betrayal, however, was always a risk. Informants or coerced civilians could expose entire groups, leading to mass arrests or executions. Living in hiding required a constant balance of trust, vigilance, and adaptability, with every action carrying potentially life or death consequences. Despite the danger, stories of bravery and ingenuity abound. Families hid in attics for months, partisans survived prolonged periods in dense forests, and children learned to navigate new identities and customs to avoid detection. These acts of survival were forms of resistance, challenging the Nazi objective of total annihilation. By maintaining life, culture, and memory, hidden Jews preserved not only themselves but also the continuity of a people that the Nazis sought to erase. The networks of support, intelligence, and solidarity formed during this time would leave a lasting imprint on the history of the Holocaust. Imagine the hidden attics, basements, and forest camps of occupied Poland. Children whispering lessons, families rationing the smallest scraps of food, partisans preparing for ambushes, and couriers moving silently under the cover of night. Each day demanded vigilance, courage, and ingenuity. Each act, whether hiding, teaching, or smuggling, represented defiance. Life in the shadows was a testament to resilience, moral courage, and the unyielding desire to survive against the forces of systematic extermination. It reminds us that the Holocaust was not only a story of death, but also of extraordinary perseverance and human spirit in the face of unimaginable danger. Chapter 9: Auschwitz-Birkenau. The epicenter of horror. By 1943, the Nazi machinery of death had reached its most terrifying scale at Auschwitz-Birkenau, a site that would come to symbolize the industrialized genocide of the Holocaust. Originally established in 1940 as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, Auschwitz rapidly expanded into a sprawling complex that included forced labor facilities, a massive extermination camp, and a network of subcamps throughout the region. Its growth reflected both the Nazi commitment to the final solution and the calculated efficiency with which they implemented mass murder. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, the lines between labor, imprisonment, and execution blurred, creating an environment where survival was precarious and death was ever-present. Auschwitz-Birkenau, located near the town of Auschwitz in southern Poland, was meticulously designed for mass killing. Its central gas chambers could process thousands of people per day, using Zyklon B as the primary agent of extermination. Upon arrival, prisoners underwent selection. Those deemed unfit for forced labor, including the elderly, children, and the infirm, were immediately sent to the gas chambers. Those who were selected for work faced grueling labor, inadequate food, and brutal treatment from guards and capos, prisoners themselves coerced into enforcing discipline. The combination of systematic execution, forced labor, and malnutrition created staggering mortality rates. The transports to Auschwitz-Birkenau were harrowing. Jews, Poles, Romani people, and others were packed into overcrowded freight cars with little ventilation, food, or water. Many died en route due to suffocation, dehydration, or illness. On arrival, the illusion of processing and hygiene masked the reality of death. Prisoners were stripped of clothing, shaved, and tattooed with identification numbers, a process designed to dehumanize and erase individuality. Personal belongings were confiscated, sorted, and sent to Germany, where they were repurposed or stored. In this system, every aspect of human life was commodified, exploited, or destroyed, reflecting the terrifying efficiency of the camp's operations. Auschwitz was not only a site of extermination but also of exploitation. The Nazis used forced labor to fuel their war machine. Factories and workshops adjacent to the camp relied on prisoners for manufacturing, construction, and maintenance. Conditions were inhumane. Prisoners worked long hours with minimal food, clothing, or rest. Disease, exhaustion, and abuse were constant companions. Despite this, some survived through skill, resilience, and occasional assistance from fellow prisoners. Life at Auschwitz became a daily negotiation between endurance and survival, where small acts, sharing food, providing comfort, or maintaining hope, could determine life or death. The psychological impact of Auschwitz was profound. Prisoners were subjected to constant surveillance, arbitrary punishment, and the terror of sudden execution. The randomness of death, combined with systematic dehumanization, created a climate of fear and despair. Families were torn apart on arrival, often never seeing each other again. Children were particularly vulnerable, stripped of protection, and often immediately killed or subjected to inhumane experiments. Survival required mental as well as physical endurance, forcing prisoners to adapt, suppress emotion, and cling to hope under circumstances designed to extinguish both. Resistance within Auschwitz, though severely limited by the oppressive environment, still occurred. Prisoners organized underground networks, smuggled information to the outside world, and, in rare instances, attempted sabotage. The Sonderkommando, forced laborers assigned to handle corpses, risked their lives to document atrocities, collect evidence, and participate in secret uprisings. One of the most notable acts of defiance occurred in October 1944, when Sonderkommando prisoners destroyed one of the crematoria using explosives smuggled from within the camp. These acts, though small in the scale of the overall horror, symbolized human resilience and moral courage in the face of systematic annihilation. Auschwitz also became a grim center for Nazi experimentation. Dr. Joseph Mengele and others conducted inhumane medical experiments on prisoners, particularly children, twins, and people with disabilities. These experiments included testing drugs, exposing individuals to extreme temperatures, and performing surgical procedures without anesthesia. The aim was not only pseudoscientific discovery but also the reinforcement of Nazi racial ideology. Victims endured unimaginable suffering, often resulting in permanent disability or death. The presence of such experiments underscores the intersection of ideology, pseudoscience, and industrialized murder that defined Auschwitz. Despite these horrors, prisoners developed ways to maintain humanity. Secret schools, religious services, cultural gatherings, and even small acts of solidarity persisted. These acts provided psychological relief, moral support, and a means to preserve identity. Sharing food, comforting one another, and documenting experiences became forms of resistance, reaffirming dignity against relentless dehumanization. Even in the darkest corners of Auschwitz-Birkenau, small sparks of humanity endured, testifying to the resilience of the human spirit. Imagine the vast expanse of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Endless barracks, the looming chimneys of crematoria, and the ceaseless movement of trains carrying the condemned. Picture the prisoners, faces gaunt from starvation, numbers tattooed on arms, eyes reflecting despair and determination. Hear the clatter of forced labor, the cries from selection lines, and the quiet murmurs of secret prayers. In this space, survival demanded ingenuity, courage, and hope, even as the machinery of death operated with chilling efficiency. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the epicenter of horror, but within it, the enduring will to survive and resist remained a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable atrocity. By mid-1943, Auschwitz-Birkenau had reached its peak as the central hub of the Holocaust in Poland. The camp's capacity for systematic extermination was unparalleled, and its operations reflected the terrifying efficiency of Nazi planning. Trains arrived daily, carrying thousands of people from ghettos across Poland and other occupied territories. Each transport brought a new wave of terror. As families were torn apart, individuals were stripped of identity, and the machinery of death moved relentlessly forward. Survival depended on a combination of physical endurance, luck, ingenuity, and the solidarity of fellow prisoners. The process upon arrival was meticulously cruel. Prisoners were forced to line up for selection, where SS doctors determined who would be sent to forced labor and who would be executed immediately. Children, the elderly, the infirm, and those deemed unfit for work were almost always sent directly to gas chambers. Those selected for labor were tattooed with identification numbers, assigned to barracks, and issued threadbare clothing. The act of tattooing, while seemingly procedural, was a profound tool of dehumanization, replacing names and identities with numbers. It stripped individuals of personal history and reduced them to mere objects within the industrialized killing system. The daily existence of prisoners selected for labor was grueling. Work assignments included quarrying stone, constructing camp infrastructure, manufacturing goods for the German war effort, and tending to the camp's internal operations. The work was exhausting, often extending from dawn to dusk, with minimal nourishment and constant surveillance. Beatings, executions for minor infractions, and psychological terror were constant. Disease and malnutrition claimed thousands, and prisoners were often forced to bury or handle corpses of fellow inmates, intensifying trauma. Yet, despite these unimaginable conditions, many survived by forming clandestine support networks, sharing food, information, and emotional sustenance. Children in Auschwitz faced unimaginable suffering. Many were killed immediately upon arrival, while others were subjected to inhumane experiments by figures such as Dr. Joseph Mengele. Twins, in particular, were targeted for experimentation, including invasive surgeries, injections, and exposure to diseases, all without anesthesia. These acts were not only physically devastating but psychologically scarring, leaving survivors with trauma that persisted for decades. Even in the face of such cruelty, some children found ways to survive, often protected by other prisoners or by chance, highlighting the resilience and adaptability required in such extreme circumstances. The camp's prisoners also engaged in forms of subtle and overt resistance. Secret religious observances, cultural activities, and educational efforts allowed prisoners to retain a sense of humanity and identity. In some barracks, prisoners held clandestine schools or organized cultural events to preserve knowledge and maintain morale. Others documented experiences through hidden notes, drawings, and diaries, ensuring that the truth of what occurred could survive. These acts were forms of intellectual and moral resistance, asserting the prisoners' humanity against the Nazis' attempts to annihilate both body and spirit. One of the most remarkable acts of defiance occurred among the Sonderkommando, forced laborers who processed the bodies of those murdered in gas chambers. Despite the immense risk, they secretly documented atrocities, collected evidence, and in some cases attempted uprisings. The October 1944 revolt, in which prisoners destroyed a crematorium using smuggled explosives, demonstrated extraordinary courage and ingenuity. Though ultimately crushed, this revolt disrupted camp operations temporarily and symbolized the resilience of the human spirit under the most extreme oppression. Auschwitz-Birkenau also exemplified the intersection of ideology and industrialized murder. The Nazis' commitment to racial extermination was codified through meticulous planning. Transport schedules, selection procedures, forced labor assignments, and disposal of bodies were all systematized. Clothing, valuables, and even hair were collected, sorted, and shipped to Germany, reflecting the horrifying efficiency with which human life was devalued. The camp functioned as both a site of mass extermination and a demonstration of the bureaucratic and logistical sophistication of the Nazi regime, blending ideology with methodical, industrialized processes. The psychological dimension of life at Auschwitz cannot be overstated. Prisoners navigated extreme fear, constant violence, and dehumanization, yet many developed coping strategies. Mutual aid, clandestine communication, and acts of solidarity were critical for maintaining morale and increasing chances of survival. Individuals formed bonds that allowed sharing of food, warning of selections, and protection of vulnerable prisoners. This network of cooperation, often invisible to guards, became a lifeline and a testament to resilience and moral courage amid pervasive terror. Imagine walking through the sprawling expanse of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Barracks stretching endlessly, the omnipresent smokestacks of crematoria, and the ceaseless movement of trains carrying new arrivals. Hear the clatter of forced labor, the cries of those being selected, and the whispered prayers of prisoners hiding acts of humanity in shadowed corners. Despite the overwhelming horror, these prisoners preserved dignity, identity, and resistance in every small act, demonstrating the endurance of human spirit against one of history's most systematic and lethal genocides. Auschwitz-Birkenau remains a somber symbol of the Holocaust, but also a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. Chapter 10: The Deportations and the Liquidation of Ghettos. By 1942 and into 1943, the Nazis had fully implemented the systematic deportation of Jews from ghettos across Poland to extermination camps, marking one of the most lethal phases of the Holocaust. Ghettos, originally established to confine and segregate Jewish populations, became temporary holding areas before mass deportation. Warsaw, Lodz, Białystok, and smaller urban centers were all affected, with transportation networks coordinated meticulously to ensure the continuous flow of victims to killing centers such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. The process reflected the terrifying bureaucratic efficiency of Nazi planning, where human lives were catalogued, transported, and exterminated on a massive industrial scale. The deportation process was deceptively structured. Jews were required to report to designated assembly points, often believing they were being relocated or sent to labor camps. Trains arrived regularly, loaded with prisoners crammed into freight cars with minimal ventilation, food, or water. Many did not survive the journey, succumbing to suffocation, dehydration, or disease. The SS and auxiliary forces managed the transports with chilling efficiency, ensuring that large numbers of people could be moved daily to the extermination camps without pause. This process, while mechanically routine for the perpetrators, resulted in unparalleled human suffering. Inside the ghettos, the psychological toll of deportations was immense. Families were torn apart, neighbors vanished overnight, and fear permeated every street. Those remaining in the ghetto were forced to witness the disappearance of loved ones, often under the guise of resettlement. Rumors and sporadic reports about the fate awaiting deportees circulated, though many struggled to comprehend the reality of extermination. These conditions generated an atmosphere of despair, yet simultaneously fueled resistance in some quarters, as survivors increasingly understood that passive compliance would likely lead to death. The logistics of deportation required careful coordination between German authorities, local police, and in many cases Jewish councils, Judenrat, which were coerced into managing lists, organizing assembly points, and maintaining order. While some council members attempted to protect vulnerable individuals by delaying deportations or falsifying records, they operated under extreme duress. The moral dilemmas were profound. Cooperation could save lives in the short term but also facilitate Nazi objectives, while refusal could result in immediate execution. The Council's precarious position highlights the complex ethical and survival challenges imposed by the occupation. Deportations often involved violent roundups. Families were forced from their homes with little notice, sometimes at gunpoint, and transported through streets filled with neighbors witnessing the events. Children, the elderly, and the sick were particularly vulnerable. Many were separated from their families immediately upon arrival at assembly points, and few were reunited. The Nazis used fear as a tool of control, employing brutal tactics to prevent resistance and enforce compliance. Despite these conditions, underground networks and resistance groups attempted to warn and protect potential victims wherever possible, smuggling information and offering escape routes when feasible. One of the most infamous episodes during this period was the liquidation of the Lodz Ghetto. Established in 1940, the ghetto became the second largest in Poland after Warsaw. By 1942, mass deportations to Chelmno extermination camp began in earnest. The ghetto's population, forced to work in industrial factories supplying the German war effort, faced systematic removal under increasingly violent circumstances. Children and the elderly were among the first targets, often sent directly to gas chambers. Those deemed capable of labor endured harsh work conditions, malnutrition, and brutality. The deportations were relentless, reducing the ghetto's population from tens of thousands to near annihilation within months. Smaller ghettos experienced similar fates, though the scale varied. In Białystok, for example, deportations to Treblinka and Auschwitz began in 1942, resulting in mass killings of the local Jewish population. Resistance was attempted in several locations, with some uprisings temporarily delaying deportations, but these were ultimately suppressed by German forces. In many cases, survival depended on individuals escaping beforehand or being hidden by sympathetic neighbors. These acts of hiding and rescue, though limited in scope, demonstrated both moral courage and human ingenuity amidst the systematic machinery of death. Deportations were not only a physical removal but also a process of psychological destruction. The process of assembling, transporting, and selecting victims was designed to strip individuals of identity, hope, and agency. Families were torn apart, belongings confiscated, and personal dignity erased. Even in the smallest ghettos, the fear of deportation created pervasive anxiety and a sense of helplessness. Yet, as horrifying as this was, it also sparked efforts to resist, document events, and preserve memory. Underground education, cultural activities, and secret archives were maintained in some ghettos even as mass deportations continued, representing acts of defiance and resilience. The deportation system also reflected the industrial scale of Nazi extermination. Trains ran like clockwork, stations became temporary holding areas, and SS personnel ensured minimal disruption to the overall process. The systematic nature of this operation illustrates the terrifying efficiency with which human lives were commodified and destroyed. Yet, amid this machinery, acts of courage persisted. Individuals had children, forged documents, and coordinated escapes. Even within such relentless oppression, human solidarity and ingenuity found ways to endure. Imagine the streets of occupied Poland during deportation rounds. Families herded through crowded alleys, neighbors watching in fear and despair, trains lined up to transport the condemned, and SS guards executing orders with cold precision. Yet, amid this horror, secret acts of defiance, hidden children, smuggled food, clandestine messages, created small sparks of hope. Each attempt to resist, preserve life, and maintain identity underscored the enduring resilience of human spirit even under the most systematic and lethal oppression. The deportations and liquidation of ghettos were central to the Nazi plan, but the courage and ingenuity of those who survived or resisted stand as enduring testaments to human strength. The liquidation of ghettos in occupied Poland escalated with terrifying precision in 1943. The Nazis' objective was clear: to empty the ghettos entirely, sending every remaining Jew to extermination camps. These operations were often swift, violent, and meticulously planned, relying on the cooperation of auxiliary police, local collaborators, and coercion of the Jewish councils. Judenrat. Residents who had endured months or years of confinement faced sudden upheaval, forced marches, and deportation, with little chance of survival. The physical and psychological strain of these operations left deep scars on survivors and communities alike. In the Warsaw Ghetto. Following the uprising, German authorities intensified deportations to Treblinka. Streets that had been the site of resistance were now systematically cleared. Families were torn from homes, often separated, and forced into overcrowded holding areas or directly onto trains. SS units employed terror tactics, including executions on the spot for any signs of defiance. Despite these efforts, some individuals managed to escape through underground tunnels or via the assistance of sympathetic non-Jews, illustrating the combination of fear, opportunity, and courage that characterized survival. Even in the face of overwhelming force, resistance persisted, though on a smaller scale than before. The Lodz Ghetto, the second largest in Poland, experienced its final liquidation in 1944. The ghetto, which had been a center of forced labor, saw systematic deportations to Auschwitz-Birkenau and Chelmno extermination camps. Children, the elderly, and those deemed incapable of work were sent directly to their deaths. Skilled laborers faced forced labor at the camps, often under brutal conditions. The liquidation process reflected the Nazis' obsession with efficiency. Transport schedules, lists of names, and coordinated roundups ensured that few escaped the machinery of death. Still, some hidden children, escaped laborers, and clandestine networks managed to preserve small pockets of life amidst the destruction. Throughout Poland, smaller towns and villages experienced similar fates. Ghettos in cities like Białystok, Lublin, and Krakow were emptied with systematic precision. The SS relied on both military force and psychological manipulation, sometimes offering temporary relocation promises to reduce resistance. Yet, reports of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz-Birkenau gradually reached ghetto inhabitants, confirming the lethal reality behind these assurances. Some attempted uprisings, such as the Białystok Ghetto uprising in August 1943, where fighters engaged German forces to resist deportation. Though these uprisings were ultimately crushed, they underscored the courage, ingenuity, and determination of a people confronting almost certain death. Deportations and liquidations also had profound psychological consequences. Witnessing neighbors, friends, and family members disappear in waves of transport created a pervasive sense of hopelessness and fear. Children were often the most vulnerable, hidden or separated from parents, their fate unknown. The ever-present threat of betrayal, the arbitrary execution of resistors, and the terror of trains departing for extermination camps meant that daily life was dominated by fear. Yet, even in these conditions, acts of solidarity and compassion persisted. Individuals risked their own lives to hide others, forge documents, or smuggle information, demonstrating resilience and moral courage amidst despair. The infrastructure supporting deportations reflected a horrifying bureaucratic efficiency. Railway lines were used with meticulous scheduling to transport large numbers of people to extermination camps daily. Freight cars, often designed for goods, were overcrowded with people, creating conditions of extreme suffering. Camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz-Birkenau were prepared to handle thousands of arrivals per day, ensuring the continuous operation of the killing apparatus. Each component of this system, trains, lists, guards, camps, functioned as part of a broader plan for industrialized extermination. Amid this systematic horror, resistance and survival persisted. Underground movements smuggled information about deportations to neighboring ghettos, allowing some to flee or hide in advance. Families concealed children in attics, forests, or monasteries, often with the assistance of sympathetic Poles or underground organizations such as Zagota. The ability to survive depended on courage, resourcefulness, and sometimes luck, highlighting the extraordinary lengths individuals went to preserve life under conditions engineered for annihilation. Every act of defiance, every successful hiding, and every documented account represented resistance against the Nazis' genocidal plan. Imagine the streets and courtyards of liquidated ghettos. Families herded toward transport points, children clinging to parents, SS officers enforcing order with brutality, and neighbors watching in fear and despair. Amid the chaos, small acts of courage, hidden children, forged documents, and secret escape routes provided moments of hope. Deportations and liquidation were not only acts of physical removal but also tools of psychological terror, intended to erase identity, community, and memory. Yet, the resilience of those who survived, resisted, or helped others endure stands as a testament to human courage and moral fortitude in one of history's darkest periods. Chapter 11: The Role of the Polish Underground and Resistance Movements. Amid the widespread persecution, deportations, and mass killings of Jews in Poland during World War II, the Polish underground emerged as a crucial force in both organized resistance and the efforts to save lives. This network, often referred to collectively as the Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, operated in parallel with various other resistance groups, including communist partisans, the National Armed Forces (NSC), and civilian support networks. Their objectives ranged from sabotage of German operations and intelligence gathering to clandestine efforts to rescue Jews from ghettos, transport them to hiding places, and supply them with food, medicine, and false documents. The complexity, scale, and courage of these efforts reflected a commitment to both national liberation and human solidarity in the face of unimaginable brutality. The Polish underground faced immense challenges. The Nazis controlled the state, police, military, and infrastructure, leaving little room for overt resistance. Communication had to be clandestine, supply lines covert, and every operation executed with precision to avoid detection. Despite this, resistance networks flourished. Couriers, often young men and women, risked capture while transporting information, food, and weapons. Underground printers produced illegal newspapers documenting atrocities and providing guidance for survival. These efforts were essential for maintaining morale, coordinating escape routes, and ensuring that Jewish populations had access to critical resources. One of the most significant contributions of the Polish underground was the organization known as Zgoda, or the Council to Aid Jews. Established in late 1942, Zgoda focused specifically on saving Jewish lives, providing safe houses, falsified identity papers, medical care, and financial support. Its members were both Jewish and non-Jewish Poles, united by a shared sense of moral duty and resistance against Nazi oppression. Despite operating in secrecy and under constant threat, Zgoda helped thousands of Jews evade deportation, survive in hiding, and in some cases join partisan units in forests. Their work was a testament to the extraordinary courage and humanity of individuals committed to saving lives amid widespread genocide. The Polish underground also engaged in intelligence-gathering operations. Members collected information about Nazi activities, including deportations, mass executions, and camp operations. This intelligence was sometimes transmitted to Allied forces, highlighting the systematic atrocities occurring in occupied Poland. Couriers carried reports of the horrors at Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Sobibor, detailing both the scale of killings and the methods employed. These accounts, while rarely enough to halt Nazi operations immediately, played a critical role in documenting genocide, informing international communities, and guiding future historical research. Armed resistance formed another dimension of the underground's work. Partisan groups operated in forests, launching attacks against German supply lines, ambushing patrols, and disrupting transport routes. Some groups focused specifically on aiding Jewish escapees, providing refuge and integrating them into operations that could improve their survival prospects. These operations required exceptional coordination, logistical skill, and bravery. The forests became a sanctuary for those fleeing ghettos, where life, though perilous, offered the possibility of agency and resistance. Unlike the enclosed ghettos, partisans could fight, forage, and plan, transforming hiding into active defiance. The relationship between the Polish underground and Jewish resistance movements was complex. While collaboration existed, tensions sometimes arose due to differing priorities, resource constraints, or political disagreements. Nevertheless, coordinated operations were carried out wherever possible, particularly during uprisings such as the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943. The underground supplied weapons, intelligence, and logistical support, though limitations in armament and numbers constrained the effectiveness of assistance. These interactions highlight both the solidarity and the challenges of resistance under extreme oppression, demonstrating that even partial collaboration could have significant life-saving impacts. Civilians played a crucial, often overlooked, role in these resistance networks. Ordinary Poles provided food, shelter, and guidance, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. Religious institutions, including priests, monks, and nuns, frequently sheltered Jewish families, providing them with safe passages, ration supplies, and spiritual support. These acts of moral courage were undertaken despite the ever-present threat of execution by German authorities for any person found aiding Jews. The collective contribution of these individuals created a decentralized yet effective system of support, allowing many to survive despite the pervasive machinery of death surrounding them. The underground's activities were not limited to immediate rescue operations. They also sought to preserve culture, memory, and education in clandestine ways. Secret schools, libraries, and religious observances allowed Jewish children and adults to maintain continuity of identity even while in hiding or displacement. Knowledge of history, religion, and language was passed down, ensuring that the cultural and moral fabric of communities persisted even under extreme conditions. These educational and cultural efforts represented a form of resistance as profound as armed defiance, asserting the resilience and dignity of those targeted for annihilation. Imagine the hidden rooms, forests, and safe houses where the Polish underground operated. Couriers moving silently under moonlight, families hidden behind false walls, partisans coordinating ambushes, and clandestine educators teaching children the knowledge they might otherwise lose. Every act, from delivering food to smuggling weapons, carried extraordinary risk. Yet, through these efforts, countless lives were saved, and the moral and cultural survival of entire communities was preserved. The Polish underground exemplifies the multifaceted nature of resistance during the Holocaust, simultaneously military, humanitarian, and moral, highlighting the extraordinary courage and resilience required to confront systematic extermination. The Polish underground's efforts extended far beyond logistics and intelligence. They represented an organized moral counterpoint to Nazi brutality. These networks faced constant danger, as German authorities employed harsh punishments for anyone aiding Jews or participating in resistance activities. Despite the risks, underground operatives demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, creating communication systems, safe houses, and clandestine supply chains that allowed thousands of Jews to survive. Their work reflected a deep understanding of both the logistical challenges of survival and the psychological needs of those living in constant fear. One critical aspect of underground operations was the creation and distribution of false identity documents. Possessing a falsified identity card or passport often meant the difference between life and death. Skilled forgers within the underground reproduced official-looking papers, stamps, and signatures that allowed Jews to pose as Christians or non-Jews, thereby evading Nazi detection. These documents were often supplemented by guidance on religious observances, local customs, and behaviors necessary to maintain the disguise. Families were trained in secrecy, learning how to answer questions, navigate public spaces, and avoid suspicion. The meticulous nature of these preparations demonstrated a combination of resourcefulness and psychological insight critical for survival. Food distribution networks were equally vital. Jews in hiding, whether in urban attics, remote villages, or forest camps, faced extreme scarcity. Underground networks provided rations, often smuggled at great personal risk, ensuring that those in hiding could maintain the strength needed to survive. Couriers traveled under cover of night, sometimes disguising themselves as German laborers, to deliver food and medicine. These efforts were coordinated with partisans and sympathetic civilians, forming a complex ecosystem of support that extended across occupied Poland. Even small contributions, like a loaf of bread or a vial of medicine, could save lives, highlighting the profound impact of collective effort in dire circumstances. The underground also played a crucial role in rescue operations during deportations. When transport lists or schedules became known in advance, members of the resistance attempted to warn targeted individuals or coordinate escapes. In some cases, Jews were hidden in secret compartments within homes, smuggled into forests, or transported to safer regions. These operations required precise timing, secrecy, and often improvisation under extreme pressure. They demonstrated not only tactical skill but also moral courage, as the risk to rescuers was absolute. Capture could result in immediate execution, yet many persisted, guided by a sense of justice and humanity. Partisan units operating in forests were another essential component of the resistance. Jewish and Polish partisans conducted sabotage, ambushes, and intelligence gathering, disrupting Nazi operations and aiding escapees. They created makeshift camps that, while rudimentary, offered a degree of freedom unavailable in urban ghettos or occupied towns. Life in these forests was perilous. Harsh weather, limited food, disease, and constant German patrols posed daily threats. Yet, the autonomy provided opportunities for both survival and defiance. These partisan networks became centers of both humanitarian and military activity, illustrating how resistance could combine ethical, strategic, and survival imperatives. Coordination between different resistance factions, though sometimes complicated by political or ideological differences, was also significant. Collaboration between the Home Army, communist partisans, and civilian networks facilitated broader rescue operations and intelligence sharing. While mistrust occasionally hampered coordination, necessity often overcame division, particularly when lives were at stake. This cooperation reflects the extraordinary human capacity to unite across differences in pursuit of a shared goal: survival and opposition to tyranny. The underground also contributed to documenting Nazi atrocities. Reports, diaries, and eyewitness accounts smuggled out of ghettos and camps provided the Allies with some of the first detailed information about the scale of the Holocaust. This documentation served multiple purposes: alerting the world, preserving memory, and creating historical records that would survive even if individual lives were lost. Couriers and informants risked their lives to ensure that the truth of the genocide was recorded and disseminated, underscoring the intellectual and moral dimensions of resistance alongside physical acts of defiance. Every element of underground activity, from forging documents and smuggling food to facilitating escape and documenting atrocities, required meticulous planning, courage, and resourcefulness. Each small act carried enormous risk but also immense potential to save lives. Families hidden in attics or forests, children disguised and taught survival skills, and entire communities preserved by networks of resistance illustrate the profound impact of these coordinated efforts. Through these actions, the Polish underground helped countless individuals survive while actively opposing Nazi goals of total extermination. Imagine the hidden corridors of occupied towns, the secret forest camps, and the small safe houses where couriers delivered food, medicine, and forged documents. Picture the young men and women navigating dangerous streets to provide intelligence, the families practicing new identities, and the partisan groups preparing ambushes to protect escapees. Every moment required courage, ingenuity, and moral determination. The Polish underground demonstrates that resistance during the Holocaust took many forms: military, humanitarian, and intellectual, and that human resilience and solidarity could endure even under the most systematic oppression. Chapter 12: Women and Children During the Holocaust in Poland. The Holocaust in Poland did not affect all victims uniformly. The experiences of women and children were particularly harrowing and distinct, reflecting the multiple layers of vulnerability and oppression imposed by the Nazi regime. Women faced unique challenges, often forced to care for families while simultaneously navigating the extreme dangers of ghetto life, deportation, forced labor, and hiding. Children, due to their age and dependence, were among the most vulnerable, frequently targeted for immediate execution or subject to inhumane medical experiments. Yet within this extreme adversity, stories of courage, resilience, and ingenuity emerged, highlighting the extraordinary strength of women and the adaptability of children in circumstances designed to obliterate them. Women in ghettos were often the primary caretakers of family life, a role made almost impossible under Nazi-imposed conditions. They struggled to provide food, medical care, and protection for children, while also facing forced labor, abuse, and the constant threat of deportation. In many ghettos, women organized clandestine networks to obtain supplies, secure hiding places, and share critical information about German operations. They were instrumental in maintaining cultural and religious continuity, teaching children prayers, history, and language in secret, often in spaces as small as closets, basements, or hidden rooms. These efforts sustained both morale and identity, serving as quiet yet vital forms of resistance. The psychological toll on women was immense. They witnessed family members and neighbors deported or executed, endured sexual violence, and navigated the complexities of survival for themselves and their children. Despite these pressures, many women displayed extraordinary resilience. Mothers often disguised their children, taught them survival skills, and hid them in attics, forests, or with sympathetic non-Jewish families. Some women even volunteered for extremely dangerous roles within underground networks, including smuggling food, medicine, or information. Their courage was often quiet but relentless, representing a blend of maternal instinct and moral resistance against systematic annihilation. Children faced unique and immediate dangers. In ghettos and camps, infants and young children were often among the first to be deported to extermination centers, considered unfit for labor. Older children, while sometimes spared initially, were subjected to forced labor, hunger, disease, and psychological trauma. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, children were frequently killed upon arrival or subjected to horrific experiments, particularly twins under the supervision of Dr. Joseph Mengele. The randomness and brutality of their experiences meant that survival often depended on quick thinking, adaptability, and, frequently, the protection of adults or networks dedicated to saving children's lives. Despite these extraordinary dangers, children demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Some learned new identities, customs, and religious practices to avoid detection while in hiding. Others were hidden in convents, monasteries, or the homes of sympathetic Poles, where they adapted to new environments while retaining knowledge of their Jewish heritage. Children who survived often did so by closely observing behaviors, mimicking others, and remaining silent under extreme pressure. Their capacity for learning, flexibility, and psychological resilience was extraordinary, and in many cases, these qualities allowed entire families or groups to evade capture and death. The interplay between women and children in survival strategies was critical. Women often acted as protectors, educators, and organizers, devising ways to conceal their children or create temporary safe havens. In the forests, mothers and grandmothers navigated the challenges of harsh weather, scarcity of food, and constant threat of discovery, while ensuring that children were fed, sheltered, and sometimes integrated into partisan activities. These efforts required not only courage and resourcefulness, but also the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, balancing the physical, psychological, and moral needs of those in their care. Underground networks recognized the specific vulnerability of women and children, and efforts were made to prioritize their safety. Zgoda, the Council to Aid Jews, often focused on finding hiding places for children and providing necessary supplies for women in hiding. Forged identity papers, rationed food, and placement in safe houses or convents were among the strategies used. In some cases, women actively participated in resistance operations, smuggling resources or providing intelligence, demonstrating that even under extreme vulnerability, agency and moral courage could persist. The experience of women and children in the Holocaust also highlighted the deliberate targeting of these groups by the Nazis. By removing women and children first in many deportations, the Nazis sought to destroy family units and weaken social cohesion. The psychological trauma of losing children, witnessing the murder of mothers, or surviving without family members created lifelong scars. Yet, amidst these atrocities, the survival of women and children, often through networks of solidarity, ingenuity, and courage, represents a remarkable testament to human endurance. Imagine the cramped attics, hidden cellars, and forest shelters where women quietly guided their children through a world of terror, teaching them prayers, sharing what little food was available, and maintaining hope in circumstances designed to extinguish it. Picture young children learning to navigate adult behaviors, remaining silent during raids, and adapting to new identities under the vigilant guidance of women who risked everything for their survival. Each day was a blend of fear, resourcefulness, and moral courage, highlighting the profound resilience of those most vulnerable during the Holocaust. The experiences of women and children underscore not only the depth of suffering but also the extraordinary acts of survival, protection, and moral defiance that persisted even under systematic attempts at annihilation. As the Holocaust intensified, the roles of women and children became even more crucial in survival and resistance. In ghettos, women often assumed the responsibility of sustaining families despite starvation, disease, and the omnipresent threat of deportation. They managed to organize clandestine kitchens, shared rationed food, and sometimes bartered goods obtained through dangerous means. Mothers hid children in small spaces, attics, or false compartments in homes, teaching them to remain silent and cautious. These acts of survival required ingenuity and bravery, as discovery by German authorities or collaborators would result in immediate execution for the entire family. Children, in turn, learned to adapt to extreme circumstances rapidly. Many memorized fake identities, religious practices, and daily routines necessary to survive in hostile environments. In some cases, older children took on responsibilities beyond their age, helping smuggle food, deliver messages, or care for younger siblings. Life for them was a constant negotiation between innocence and the harsh demands of survival. Despite their vulnerability, children often exhibited extraordinary resilience, guided by instinct, intuition, and the protective efforts of women who risked everything for their safety. In concentration and extermination camps, the plight of women and children was particularly brutal. Women were subjected to forced labor, medical experimentation, sexual violence, and separation from their families. Children, as the most defenseless, were frequently murdered immediately upon arrival or used in Nazi medical experiments. Twins, for instance, were targeted in grotesque studies conducted by Dr. Joseph Mengele, subjected to invasive surgeries, injections, and exposure to deadly pathogens. These actions reflected the extreme dehumanization and cruelty of Nazi ideology, aiming not only to exterminate individuals but to obliterate entire generations of families. Despite the horrors, women became central figures in clandestine networks and survival strategies. They organized hiding places, provided critical information, and maintained cultural and religious practices even under extreme oppression. Underground organizations like Ghettos worked closely with women to provide safe houses, forged documents, and food supplies. In many cases, women coordinated the logistics of hiding children, teaching them essential survival skills, and ensuring that moral and educational guidance continued despite the ever-present danger of discovery. Forests and remote rural areas became essential sanctuaries for women and children. Living in makeshift camps with partisans or sympathetic locals, they faced harsh weather, limited food, and disease, but gained a degree of safety and autonomy unavailable in ghettos or urban hiding places. Women managed these camps, teaching children essential survival skills while organizing daily routines, foraging for food, and maintaining hygiene under extremely difficult conditions. These acts of leadership and endurance were critical in ensuring the survival of both children and the broader community. Psychologically, the experiences of women and children were marked by trauma, loss, and fear. Yet, acts of education, storytelling, and religious observance provided crucial support. Mothers taught children prayers, history, and moral values, maintaining a sense of identity and cultural continuity. Small acts of solidarity, sharing food, comforting one another, or providing encouragement, offered emotional sustenance in the face of systematic dehumanization. Even amid pervasive terror, these acts preserved a sense of humanity and hope. The Nazi strategy deliberately targeted women and children to dismantle family structures and weaken social cohesion. Deportations often prioritized these groups, reflecting the calculated cruelty of the Holocaust. Women and children were not only victims but active participants in survival and resistance, demonstrating adaptability, courage, and moral resilience. Their ability to endure, protect, and educate under extreme conditions ensured the continuity of communities, cultures, and identities threatened with annihilation. Imagine the hidden attics, forest shelters, and safe houses of occupied Poland. Mothers whispering survival instructions, children practicing new identities, and families clinging to hope despite starvation and fear. Picture young girls and boys learning to navigate a world of constant danger, guided by the bravery and ingenuity of women who risked everything for their protection. Each day required vigilance, courage, and resourcefulness, revealing both the vulnerability and extraordinary resilience of these groups. The experiences of women and children during the Holocaust illuminate the depths of suffering while highlighting the remarkable capacity for survival, leadership, and moral courage in the face of systematic extermination. Chapter 13: Resistance Uprisings. From the Warsaw Ghetto to the forest partisans, as the Nazi regime intensified its genocidal operations in Poland, acts of organized resistance emerged as powerful expressions of defiance, courage, and the refusal to accept annihilation. Among the most iconic of these was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943, a landmark event that demonstrated the extraordinary bravery of individuals confronting overwhelming odds. Though the ghetto had been surrounded by walls, sealed off from the outside world, and systematically depopulated through deportations, the remaining inhabitants, including the Jewish Combat Organization, OB, and Jewish Military Union, ZZW, chose to resist rather than surrender. The uprising, though ultimately crushed, became a symbol of moral and armed defiance during the Holocaust. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was preceded by meticulous planning under extremely constrained conditions. Weapons were scarce and largely obtained through smuggling or black market contacts with the Polish underground. Fighters were predominantly young men and women, many in their teens and early 20s, who had lost family members to deportations and were acutely aware of the stakes. They prepared underground bunkers, escape routes, and secret communication lines, fully aware that German forces vastly outnumbered them and were armed with superior firepower. The courage required to plan and execute such an uprising under these conditions is difficult to overstate. When the Germans entered the ghetto to conduct final deportations, they encountered fierce resistance. Fighters engaged in armed confrontations, using pistols, Molotov cocktails, and homemade explosives to repel soldiers and stall their advance. Though the Germans eventually breached the ghetto walls, the resistance delayed deportations and inflicted casualties, disrupting Nazi plans and demonstrating the human capacity for defiance even in seemingly hopeless circumstances. For nearly a month, ghetto fighters held out in bunkers, sewers, and hidden rooms, representing a remarkable coordination of courage, strategy, and resilience in the face of overwhelming force. The Warsaw Uprising also highlighted the role of non-combatants in resistance. Families provided shelter to fighters, supplied food, and conveyed information about German movements. Civilians risked execution to assist combatants, emphasizing the collective nature of resistance. Even acts as seemingly small as relaying messages, hiding weapons, or warning of incoming patrols had profound implications for the survival and effectiveness of the fighters. The uprising was thus not only a military effort but also a deeply social endeavor, relying on community solidarity under extreme duress. Beyond Warsaw, resistance in smaller towns and rural areas also emerged, often in the form of forest-based partisan groups. These groups, comprising both Jews and non-Jewish Poles, engaged in sabotage operations, attacked German patrols, and provided refuge for escapees. Forests offered concealment from German surveillance, and the partisan lifestyle, though harsh, allowed for both survival and active defiance. These units often collaborated with the Polish underground to coordinate attacks, smuggle supplies, and maintain communication with other resistance networks. Partisan operations exemplified the dual focus of resistance: immediate survival and active disruption of Nazi objectives. Jewish partisans in particular faced extraordinary challenges. Many were refugees from ghettos or escaped deportation, arriving in forests weakened by malnutrition, illness, and trauma. Yet, they quickly adapted to a life of extreme hardship, learning to forage, hunt, and navigate dangerous terrain. Some operated as independent units, while others integrated into larger partisan groups, contributing intelligence, labor, and combat skills. These operations were often risky, with German patrols actively seeking to destroy partisan bases. Still, their efforts saved lives, delayed Nazi operations, and provided a space where Jews could reclaim agency and resist extermination. Resistance movements also played a critical role in documenting the atrocities of the Holocaust. Fighters and partisans collected evidence of massacres, deportations, and forced labor, often smuggling these records to the Polish underground and, in some cases, to Allied authorities. This documentation served as both a moral and historical tool, preserving the truth of Nazi crimes even when immediate action to stop them was impossible. The collection and preservation of such evidence highlight the intellectual and moral dimension of resistance alongside armed and survivalist activities. The psychological impact of uprisings and partisan operations was significant. Even when ultimately unsuccessful in military terms, these acts of defiance reinforced the dignity and humanity of participants. For victims and observers, resistance provided hope, moral reinforcement, and an assertion that life, identity, and culture could not be entirely erased by systematic terror. The courage displayed by those who resisted, whether in the streets of Warsaw or the dense forests of occupied Poland, left an enduring legacy of moral fortitude and human resilience that continues to inspire generations. Imagine the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto. Barricades hastily erected, fighters engaging German soldiers from hidden corners, the muffled cries of civilians, and the resolute determination of those refusing to surrender. Picture the forest partisans navigating dense underbrush, evading patrols, and coordinating attacks while ensuring the survival of escapees. Each act of resistance, from armed engagement to the smallest gestures of support, represented defiance against a regime designed to annihilate human life. The uprisings and partisan activities in Poland demonstrate that even amidst extreme oppression, the human spirit can assert agency. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising, while the most widely known, was part of a broader tapestry of resistance efforts throughout occupied Poland. Other urban centers, including Białystok, Lublin, and Vilnius, witnessed smaller but significant uprisings, often coordinated by local underground groups or inspired by the growing awareness of the scale of Nazi atrocities. In Białystok, for example, Jewish fighters staged an armed revolt in August 1943 as the Nazis attempted to deport the remaining ghetto population. Though the uprising was swiftly crushed, it disrupted deportations, inflicted German casualties, and provided survivors with the opportunity to escape into surrounding forests, where they could join partisan units or find temporary refuge. Forest-based partisan groups became essential lifelines for those fleeing deportations. These groups ranged from small bands of a few dozen to larger units numbering several hundred, often comprising both Jews and non-Jewish Poles. Life in the forests was grueling. Food was scarce, winters were harsh, and German patrols constantly threatened detection and destruction. Nevertheless, the forests offered a rare combination of survival and agency. Partisans cultivated skills in navigation, combat, and foraging, while simultaneously creating networks to protect women, children, and elderly escapees. In this way, forest encampments became both strategic and humanitarian centers, balancing armed defiance with the protection of vulnerable populations. One of the remarkable aspects of partisan operations was the inclusion of women and children. Women served as couriers, medics, and cooks, as well as organizers of shelter and sustenance. Children, often learning survival skills from adults, contributed by carrying messages, assisting with foraging, or providing early warning of approaching patrols. These contributions were essential to the functioning of partisan networks, demonstrating how survival and resistance were deeply interconnected. The adaptability of these groups, along with the collective efforts of men, women, and children, created a microcosm of organized defiance that could resist, if temporarily, the Nazi extermination machine. Partisan networks also coordinated with the larger Polish underground Armia Krajowa, linking forest operations with intelligence gathering, sabotage, and communication channels. Couriers carried reports of atrocities, escapee needs, and German troop movements. Weapons, food, and medical supplies were distributed from urban underground networks to forest units, enabling sustained resistance. This collaboration highlights the integration of humanitarian and military objectives, showing that survival efforts were not isolated but part of a broader strategy to oppose Nazi occupation and genocide. The moral dimension of partisan and ghetto uprisings is particularly striking. Fighters confronted a regime with overwhelming military superiority, yet chose to act in defense of human life and dignity. Even when victories were limited or temporary, these acts provided hope, preserved morale, and symbolically challenged the perception of total Nazi control. For observers, the knowledge that resistance existed, even under extreme conditions, reinforced the possibility of agency and defiance, demonstrating that human courage could survive even the most systematic attempts at annihilation. Resistance efforts were also instrumental in saving lives. Underground networks and partisans facilitated escapes from deportation trains, provided false identities, and offered refuge in forests or sympathetic households. Children and vulnerable adults were prioritized for protection, with community-wide coordination ensuring the best possible chances of survival. Each act of rescue, whether small or large, contributed to a broader strategy of human preservation amidst systematic extermination. The effectiveness of these operations depended not only on courage but also on meticulous planning, collaboration, and adaptability under constantly shifting threats. The documentation of atrocities remained a core function of resistance groups. Fighters and underground operatives recorded deportations, mass executions, and camp operations, often at great personal risk. These records, some of which reached Allied authorities, became crucial historical evidence of the Holocaust. They served multiple purposes: alerting the world, providing a moral record of defiance, and ensuring that the experiences of victims and survivors were not erased. By preserving these accounts, the resistance created a legacy of memory, truth, and accountability that would endure beyond the war. Imagine the forests and hidden urban spaces of occupied Poland. Partisan units moving silently under moonlight, families and children sheltered in attics and secret compartments, and couriers delivering vital intelligence. Picture the defiance of those who, despite starvation, disease, and the constant threat of execution, continued to resist, document, and protect human life. Every act, from armed engagement to clandestine rescue, represented courage, resilience, and moral determination. The uprisings, both in cities and forests, demonstrate that even amid overwhelming terror, human beings found ways to assert agency, protect others, and preserve dignity in the face of genocide. The story of resistance in Poland illustrates that the Holocaust, while defined by systematic extermination, was also a theater of extraordinary courage and human ingenuity. From the barricades of the Warsaw Ghetto to the hidden enclaves of forest partisans, these acts of defiance provide enduring lessons about resilience, moral courage, and the capacity for humanity to persist even in the darkest circumstances. Chapter 14: The Liberation of Camps and the Aftermath in Poland. By the latter stages of World War II, the tide of the conflict had begun to shift. The Soviet Red Army advanced steadily from the east, while Allied forces pressed from the west, signaling the impending collapse of Nazi control in occupied Poland. For prisoners of ghettos and concentration camps, this period was marked by a complex mixture of hope, despair, and relentless survival. Many had endured years of starvation, forced labor, disease, and the trauma of witnessing mass executions. Yet, the approach of liberation brought the possibility of survival, though even in these final months, Nazi cruelty persisted with forced evacuations, death marches, and continued extermination efforts. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the extermination camps, exemplified the late-war dynamics of liberation. As Soviet forces neared in early 1945, the Nazis initiated forced evacuations of prisoners. Tens of thousands were marched westward in brutal winter conditions, an ordeal known as the Death Marches. Prisoners faced sub-zero temperatures, minimal clothing, exhaustion, and summary execution for any perceived inability to keep pace. Those who survived these marches were eventually liberated by advancing Allied forces, though the physical and psychological scars of the journey persisted. Death marches became one of the final expressions of Nazi cruelty, reflecting both desperation and ideological commitment to extermination even as military defeat loomed. Other camps experienced similar evacuations and atrocities. In Treblinka, Sobibor, and Majdanek, prisoners were either executed or forced on marches to other camps in an attempt to conceal evidence of mass killings. Survivors who endured these final phases bore witness to the relentless nature of Nazi extermination policies. Even in the final weeks, the systematic nature of the Holocaust was evident. Meticulous documentation, forced labor, and coordinated transport operations continued despite the imminent collapse of the Third Reich. The liberation of camps was a moment of profound relief and unimaginable trauma. Survivors emerged into a world where their families, communities, and entire social structures had been largely destroyed. They faced immediate health crises, including extreme malnutrition, infectious disease, and psychological trauma. Many had lost siblings, parents, and children, leaving them to confront the complex task of survival and rebuilding in a landscape that had been devastated both physically and socially. Relief operations, including emergency medical care, food distribution, and temporary shelters, were organized by Allied military forces and humanitarian organizations, yet the scale of need often exceeded the available resources. Documentation and evidence gathering became crucial during and immediately after liberation. Allied forces, journalists, and survivors themselves meticulously recorded the conditions of the camps, mass graves, and the accounts of those who had endured years of persecution. Photographs, testimonies, and physical evidence were preserved to ensure accountability and historical accuracy. These efforts were essential not only for prosecuting Nazi war criminals, but also for preserving the memory of the Holocaust and educating future generations about the mechanisms and consequences of systemic genocide. Poland itself faced unique challenges in the aftermath of liberation. Many towns and cities had been destroyed, infrastructure was in ruins, and returning survivors often found their former homes occupied or looted. Displaced persons camps were established to provide temporary shelter, food, and medical care. Jews who had survived ghettos, camps, or hiding had to navigate hostile or indifferent local populations, reclaim property, and rebuild their social networks. Anti-Semitic violence, though diminished under Allied oversight, persisted in some regions, complicating the process of reintegration and recovery. Rehabilitation and psychological recovery were significant challenges. Survivors grappled with profound trauma, including survivors' guilt, grief, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Many children had been orphaned, losing parents and siblings to deportation or murder, and had to reconstruct identities in new family units or communities. Educational programs, religious institutions, and humanitarian organizations played critical roles in supporting survivors, offering counseling, schooling, and moral guidance as they sought to reclaim lives disrupted by years of violence and terror. Humanitarian efforts extended beyond immediate relief. Organizations such as the Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, and other Jewish relief groups coordinated efforts to reunite families, provide medical care, and assist survivors in emigrating to safer countries. Survivors were encouraged to document their experiences, not only as a tool for legal accountability, but as a mechanism for preserving memory. This process emphasized the importance of individual and collective narratives in understanding the Holocaust and preventing future atrocities. Imagine the gates of Auschwitz opening to reveal survivors emaciated, exhausted, and overwhelmed by freedom. Soldiers and aid workers offering food, medical care, and blankets, while survivors attempted to reconcile the horror they had endured with the hope of survival. Across the liberated camps in Poland, thousands emerged into a world where devastation and opportunity coexisted, requiring immediate resilience, adaptation, and a reconstruction of identity. The liberation was both an end and a beginning. An end to systematic persecution, but a beginning of recovery, remembrance, and the arduous task of rebuilding lives from the ruins of genocide. As liberation spread across Poland in 1944 and 1945, survivors faced a reality that was both hopeful and devastating. The Red Army advanced into eastern Poland, liberating camps such as Majdanek and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Soldiers encountered emaciated survivors, piles of corpses, and remnants of the Nazi machinery of death. The liberation of these camps revealed the full scope of the atrocities committed. Industrialized murder, medical experiments, and systematic attempts to erase Jewish and other targeted communities from existence. For many survivors, the first moments of freedom were bittersweet. Joy at being alive was intertwined with grief, shock, and a profound sense of loss. One of the immediate challenges after liberation was the care of survivors. Malnutrition, disease, and untreated injuries were widespread. Humanitarian organizations and allied military units established temporary hospitals, feeding centers, and housing facilities. Food had to be carefully rationed and reintroduced gradually to prevent refeeding syndrome, which could be fatal to those who had endured prolonged starvation. Medical teams also faced the challenge of treating psychological trauma, as survivors struggled to comprehend the scale of the atrocities they had witnessed and endured. Reconnecting with family and community proved to be another complex challenge. Many survivors returned to their hometowns only to find them destroyed or occupied by others. Entire families had been annihilated, leaving orphans and lone survivors. Displaced persons camps became essential, serving as temporary shelters while survivors attempted to locate relatives, rebuild communities, and plan for emigration. In some cases, surviving children were reunited with distant relatives, while others were placed in foster homes or orphanages. These reunifications were emotionally charged, blending relief, sorrow, and the long process of healing. The psychological scars endured by survivors were profound. Years of starvation, forced labor, confinement, and witnessing mass murder left survivors with post-traumatic stress, depression, and survivor's guilt. Many struggled to communicate their experiences, both because of the trauma itself and because of disbelief or indifference from surrounding communities. Support groups, religious institutions, and emerging survivor networks played a vital role in helping individuals process their experiences, preserve their identity, and cultivate a sense of belonging despite the enormous losses. Reconstruction efforts also involved reclaiming property and community infrastructure. Synagogues, schools, and homes had often been destroyed or occupied, complicating efforts to reestablish normal life. Anti-Semitic incidents in some regions posed additional challenges, demonstrating that liberation did not automatically guarantee safety or acceptance. In response, many survivors sought emigration, joining displaced persons programs that facilitated relocation to Palestine, the United States, or other countries where they could rebuild their lives in relative safety. These migrations became a crucial part of post-war Jewish survival and the reconstruction of communities destroyed during the Holocaust. The documentation of atrocities continued to be a priority in the post-liberation period. Survivors provided testimonies, diaries, and other accounts to military authorities, humanitarian organizations, and journalists. These records were instrumental in the prosecution of Nazi war criminals during trials such as Nuremberg and subsequent proceedings in Poland and other countries. The meticulous documentation preserved individual experiences and provided irrefutable evidence of systematic genocide, ensuring that the crimes of the Holocaust could not be denied or forgotten. Memory and commemoration emerged as central themes in the aftermath of liberation. Survivors and communities worked to preserve the stories of those who had perished, erect memorials, and maintain cultural and religious traditions. Educational efforts, museums, and survivor testimonies became critical tools for raising awareness about the Holocaust, fostering understanding, and ensuring that the atrocities were neither forgotten nor repeated. The moral and historical responsibility of remembering the victims and the survivors became a guiding principle in post-war Poland and internationally. The liberation of camps also illuminated the resilience of the human spirit. Despite unimaginable suffering, survivors demonstrated extraordinary endurance, resourcefulness, and determination to rebuild lives. Acts of courage, solidarity, and moral commitment persisted, whether in the establishment of schools, hospitals, and religious institutions, or in the efforts to care for orphan children and traumatized families. The process of rebuilding was slow, painful, and ongoing, but it showcased the capacity for renewal even after systematic attempts at destruction. Imagine the liberated landscapes of Poland. Survivors walking free after years of confinement, aid workers providing medical care and food, children cautiously exploring the world outside camp fences, and communities beginning the slow work of recovery. Each act of rebuilding, from simple meals to the re-establishment of schools and synagogues, represented resilience, hope, and a commitment to life in the face of death. The liberation of camps and the subsequent aftermath illustrate the duality of survival. The immediate relief of freedom intertwined with the long-term challenges of recovery, remembrance, and reconstruction in a world forever changed by genocide. Chapter 15: Legacy, Memory, and Lessons from the Holocaust in Poland. The Holocaust in Poland left an indelible mark not only on the survivors but on the global consciousness. Its legacy is complex, encompassing historical memory, moral responsibility, and the enduring consequences of one of history's most systematic genocides. By the end of World War II, Poland had lost an overwhelming proportion of its Jewish population, with millions of lives extinguished and countless communities obliterated. The scale of destruction demanded both immediate reckoning and long-term reflection, raising questions about human nature, morality, resilience, and the responsibilities of societies to prevent such atrocities in the future. Memory and commemoration became central in preserving the lessons of the Holocaust. Survivors, historians, and communities undertook the task of documenting individual and collective experiences to ensure that the enormity of what occurred would not be forgotten. Institutions such as the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, memorial sites across former ghetto locations, and local museums in towns like Lodz and Warsaw serve as enduring reminders of both human suffering and resilience. These spaces offer visitors an opportunity to engage with history, reflect on moral imperatives, and bear witness to the consequences of hatred, prejudice, and authoritarianism. Education emerged as one of the most critical elements in Holocaust legacy. Schools, universities, and cultural institutions incorporated Holocaust studies into curricula to ensure that future generations understand the mechanisms, consequences, and human stories behind systematic genocide. Survivors contributed to these educational efforts, sharing first-hand accounts that provide a depth of understanding impossible to convey through statistics alone. Educational initiatives emphasize the dangers of unchecked prejudice, authoritarian rule, and social indifference, teaching the moral and ethical lessons necessary to prevent similar atrocities. The documentation of survivor testimonies, diaries, photographs, and official records provided a foundation not only for historical research but also for legal accountability. The Nuremberg trials, as well as subsequent prosecutions in Poland and other countries, relied heavily on these first-hand accounts to prosecute Nazi perpetrators. Beyond legal justice, these records underscore the importance of memory as a tool against denial, distortion, and forgetting. They remind the world that the Holocaust was a deliberate, organized campaign of extermination, emphasizing both the need for vigilance against genocide and the capacity for resilience in the human spirit. The cultural impact of the Holocaust is profound. Literature, art, music, and film have all grappled with the realities of extermination and survival. Works by survivors such as Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, and many Polish authors provide an intimate window into individual experiences, exploring themes of trauma, morality, identity, and perseverance. Artistic and literary representations have allowed societies to process collective grief, reflect on moral responsibility, and engage with the historical reality of genocide in ways that complement scholarly research. Poland itself faced ongoing challenges in confronting and memorializing the Holocaust. Post-war political shifts, including Soviet influence and communist governance, complicated public discourse about responsibility, memory, and collaboration. Despite these challenges, Jewish and non-Jewish Poles worked to preserve historical memory, establish cemeteries, memorials, and educational centers, and ensure that the experiences of victims were not erased. Over decades, these efforts contributed to a nuanced understanding of both the horrors of occupation and the complex dynamics of resistance, complicity, and survival. The moral lessons of the Holocaust are profound and enduring. The systematic destruction of communities illustrates the dangers of prejudice, discrimination, and dehumanization. It highlights the consequences of societal indifference, authoritarianism, and the failure to intervene in the face of injustice. At the same time, the acts of courage, solidarity, and resistance undertaken by individuals and communities demonstrate that humanity persists even under extreme oppression. The stories of women and children, underground resistance fighters, and partisan networks emphasize moral courage, empathy, and the capacity for extraordinary resilience. The Holocaust in Poland also reshaped global perspectives on human rights, leading to the development of international norms and institutions designed to prevent future genocides. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, and later conventions against genocide were, in part, responses to the atrocities experienced by Polish Jews and other victims of the Nazi regime. These legal frameworks provide tools for accountability and moral guidance, ensuring that the lessons of history inform contemporary policies and ethical standards. Imagine the sights across Poland: the silent barracks of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto walls, the preserved forests where partisans hid, and the commemorative plaques marking deportation points. Each location carries stories of suffering, courage, and survival, offering powerful lessons for reflection. Visitors and scholars alike are reminded that the Holocaust was not an abstract event, but a human tragedy with tangible locations, faces, and experiences, demanding both remembrance and moral vigilance. The final chapter of the Holocaust in Poland is as much about the enduring memory as it is about the events themselves. Survivors and their descendants have faced the ongoing challenge of reconciling the trauma of genocide with the imperative to rebuild lives, communities, and cultural identity. In the years following liberation, displaced persons often relocated to other countries, including Israel, the United States, Canada, and parts of Western Europe. These migrations carried with them the stories, traditions, and memories of Polish Jewry, ensuring that the legacy of communities decimated by the Holocaust would continue in diaspora. Memory work, both personal and collective, has been central to preserving history. Survivors wrote memoirs, recorded testimonies, and participated in interviews that became foundational sources for education and research. These narratives provide not only factual accounts but also intimate glimpses into the psychological and moral experiences of those who lived through the Holocaust. Institutions such as Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and local museums in Poland have collaborated with survivors to create archives that safeguard these stories. By documenting names, faces, and personal experiences, memory work resists the abstraction of genocide and humanizes historical understanding. Communities across Poland have worked to reclaim and preserve physical spaces associated with the Holocaust. Synagogues, cemeteries, and former ghetto sites serve as tangible reminders of lives once lived and communities erased. Annual commemorations, Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremonies, and guided educational tours offer opportunities for reflection, dialogue, and engagement with history. These acts of remembrance honor victims and survivors while educating broader audiences about the consequences of hatred, intolerance, and unchecked authoritarianism. The Holocaust lessons extend far beyond historical documentation. They serve as ethical and moral guidance for contemporary societies. The systematic dehumanization, mass killings, and persecution demonstrate how prejudice, propaganda, and obedience to authority can escalate into genocide when unchecked. By studying the Holocaust, communities are reminded of the importance of civic responsibility, human rights advocacy, and vigilance against discrimination. The moral imperative to recognize the dignity of all individuals emerges as a universal lesson, with the Polish experience providing a particularly vivid and tragic illustration. Artistic and cultural expressions continue to play a role in Holocaust memory. Literature, film, theater, and visual arts explore both the suffering and resilience of victims and survivors, offering perspectives that transcend purely historical accounts. Works inspired by the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, forest partisans, or survivor memoirs allow audiences to emotionally connect with the events, cultivating empathy, understanding, and moral reflection. These cultural expressions ensure that memory is not only preserved but also continually interpreted and integrated into broader societal consciousness. Educational initiatives in Poland and internationally have emphasized the importance of teaching about the Holocaust as a tool for moral and civic development. Schools incorporate survivor testimonies, primary documents, and historical analysis to ensure that students understand both the scale of the atrocities and the human experiences behind them. Lessons on the Holocaust foster critical thinking about prejudice, ethical decision-making, and the responsibilities of citizens to resist injustice. By embedding Holocaust education into curricula, societies aim to cultivate awareness and resilience against contemporary forms of hatred and discrimination. Poland's post-Holocaust history is also marked by efforts to confront collaboration, complicity, and moral ambiguity. Scholarly research, public discourse, and legal investigations have examined how ordinary citizens, government institutions, and local communities navigated occupation. These studies highlight that moral choices were complex, shaped by fear, coercion, and survival instincts. At the same time, stories of courage, assistance, and solidarity underscore that ethical action persisted even under extreme oppression. The nuanced understanding of complicity and resistance provides valuable lessons for contemporary ethical reflection and historical accountability. Imagine walking through Warsaw or Krakow today. Memorial plaques marking ghetto walls, cemeteries preserved amidst modern urban life, and quiet monuments honoring those lost. Envision the forests where partisans hid, now peaceful landscapes that bear silent testimony to the courage of those who resisted. Picture classrooms where children learn not only facts but also the moral weight of history, understanding that remembrance carries responsibility. The legacy of the Holocaust in Poland is both spatial and temporal, rooted in memory, education, and moral reflection, demanding active engagement with history rather than passive observation. The story of the Holocaust in Poland closes with a dual message, a reminder of the depths of human cruelty and a testament to human resilience, courage, and moral strength. From the ghettos to the forests, from concentration camps to liberation and reconstruction, Polish Jews and their allies demonstrated the capacity for survival, defiance, and ethical commitment even under conditions designed to erase them. Remembering these events, preserving their memory, and teaching future generations are not only acts of tribute, but also safeguards against the repetition of such atrocities. The Holocaust in Poland thus stands as a profound historical and moral lesson, illustrating both the consequences of hatred and the enduring power of human dignity.